Hannah Carter did not flinch when Brad Collins said he didn't want her. She stood perfectly still on that Wyoming platform, her worn suitcase at her feet. The January wind cutting straight through her coat, and she looked him dead in the eye, while every soul in Milford watched and waited for her to break. He told her he loved someone else. He told her she could find her own way home. And Hannah Carter, who had sold nearly everything she owned to board that train, simply said, "All right." She didn't cry, not once. If you're just finding this channel, please subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, and Hannah Carter had read it so many times since then that the paper had gone soft at the folds. She kept it tucked inside her coat pocket during the entire 3-day train ride from Millfield, Ohio, all the way to Milford, Wyoming. Not because she needed to read it again, but because holding it made the whole impossible thing feel real. Brad Collins had written her 6 letters over the course of 4 months. 6 letters full of Wyoming sky and open land, and a man who said he was ready to stop being alone. He'd used words like devoted and earnest, and I believe you are exactly the kind of woman this ranch needs. He'd described his house, his cattle, his ambitions. He had never once said he loved her, but Hannah had told herself that was honest, and she respected honest men. She was 25 years old, the daughter of a hardware store owner, and a woman who had taught her that a clean kitchen and a generous table were worth more than any number of pretty words. She was not a dreamer by nature. She was careful and steady and practical, and she had looked at those 6 letters the same way she looked at anything squarely without sentiment, asking herself what was real and what was wishful thinking. What was real was that she had no suitors in Millfield, no prospects that weren't tied to men twice her age or half her ambition, and a father whose store was failing badly enough that her staying home was one more mouth and one less problem he needed. What was wishful thinking was that any of this would be easy. But Hannah Carter had never been afraid of things that weren't easy. She had packed 1 suitcase, sold her grandmother's brooch and the silver-backed hairbrush that had sat on her dresser since she was 12. Bought a one-way ticket because a round trip cost more than she had, and because she had decided to commit to the thing completely or not at all. Her mother had pressed both hands against Hannah's face before she boarded and said, "You are braver than you know, baby girl." And Hannah had held that for the entire journey like a second coat. The train pulled into Milford just past noon on a Wednesday in mid-January, and Hannah stepped onto the platform and immediately understood that Wyoming cold was an entirely different creature from Ohio cold. It came from everywhere at once, from the ground and the sky and the spaces between buildings, and it had a particular authority to it, as though the land itself was informing her that she was a guest here and would remain one until proven otherwise. She straightened her shoulders. She picked up her suitcase. She looked around the platform for Brad Collins. She spotted him almost immediately because he was the best-dressed man in sight. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 30s, with a fine coat and an expression she couldn't quite read from a distance. He was standing with a group of men near the far end of the platform, and beside him stood a woman in a deep green dress who was laughing at something one of the men had said. Hannah walked toward him with her chin up and her grip firm on the suitcase handle. And when he saw her coming, something shifted in his face. Not pleasure, not even recognition in the welcoming sense. Something closer to discomfort. "Mr. Collins," Hannah said, stopping a few feet away, because she had not been raised to assume familiarity before it was offered. "Miss Carter," he said. He did not move toward her. He did not remove his hat. He stood where he was and looked at her with that uncomfortable expression, and said nothing else for a moment that stretched out longer than it had any right to. Around them, the platform was not empty. There were a half-dozen ranch hands loading supplies, 3 women from what appeared to be the local dry goods store, watching with undisguised interest. A man in a minister's collar, who happened to be passing through, and the station clerk who had stopped pretending to work entirely. Hannah was aware of all of them in the way that a person becomes aware of an audience before they fully understand they're standing on a stage. "I need to speak plainly with you," Brad Collins said. "All right," Hannah said. "I wrote to you in good faith when I wrote those letters," he said, and his voice was not unkind exactly, but it had the particular quality of a man who had rehearsed this and was now discovering that rehearsed words feel worse coming out than they did going in. I believed at the time that I was ready for what I proposed. A practical arrangement. A woman to manage the house and provide stability. I thought that was what I needed. And now, Hannah said. He glanced sideways at the woman in the green dress, and Hannah understood everything in that single glance, understood it with absolute clarity, the way you understand something when you've suspected it all along, but refused to look at it directly. The woman in the green dress was not looking at Hannah. She was examining the buttons on her sleeve with great concentration. "I've since come to realize," Brad Collins said, "that I am in love with Miss Evelyn Marsh. We've come to an understanding over the past several weeks. I should have written to you. I meant to write to you. But I didn't know how to. I wasn't certain until recently, and by the time I was certain you were already—" He stopped. He cleared his throat. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The inconvenience. Hannah stood with 3,000 miles of train travel in her bones, and $62 left to her name, and her grandmother's brooch already gone, and a suitcase with everything she owned, standing on a Wyoming platform in January, and Brad Collins called it an inconvenience. She could feel the cold now in a way she hadn't before. Not the wind. Something underneath the wind. Something that wanted to come up through her chest and out through her eyes and make a spectacle of her in front of every person on that platform who was watching and waiting to see what the rejected Ohio woman would do. She did not let it. "I see," Hannah said. Her voice was steady. She was quite proud of that. "Thank you for telling me in person, Mr. Collins." He blinked. He had clearly expected something else, tears perhaps, or accusation, or at minimum a visible trembling. Yes, of course. I truly am sorry, Miss Carter. If there is anything I can do to assist with arrangements for a return journey." "That won't be necessary," Hannah said. She turned away from him deliberately and walked to the nearest bench on the platform and sat down and put her suitcase between her feet and looked out at the street beyond the station. She heard him say something else low and halting, and then she heard him walk away, and then she heard the woman in the green dress say something quiet, and Brad Collins say something back, and then their footsteps faded. The platform didn't empty out as fast as Hannah would have liked. She was aware of the women from the dry goods store whispering. She was aware of the station clerk who had gone back to his work but kept glancing over. She stared at the street and thought with brutal practicality about her situation, because she could not afford the luxury of sitting there feeling what she felt. $62. One suitcase. A train ticket that was not returned. January in Wyoming. No family within 3,000 miles. No friends. No one who knew her name. She thought, now what? Not in despair, or not entirely in despair. It was a real question. Practical and immediate and demanding an answer. Now what, Hannah Carter? What do you actually do from here? She was still thinking it through: the hotel question, the money question, the work question, whether there was a position as a seamstress or a teacher's aide. Somewhere in this town, she could pursue for long enough to save train fare home, when she became aware of a shadow falling across the bench beside her. She looked up. The man standing there was not what she would have called immediately remarkable. He was perhaps 35 or 37, tall in the particular way of men who have done physical work their entire lives, not showy, just substantial. He had dark eyes set in a weathered face and a coat that was expensive but well used, and he was turning his hat in his hands in a way that suggested he had manners enough to have removed it, but wasn't entirely sure what he intended to say now that he had. There were two more men standing a few feet behind him, both of them looking elsewhere, with the studied casualness of people who were pretending they weren't there. Hannah waited. "I apologize for the interruption," the man said. His voice was deep and unhurried, and the Wyoming in it was unmistakable. "I saw what happened over there." "So did everyone else on this platform," Hannah said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "That's true enough. I won't pretend otherwise." He held the hat still for a moment. "My name is Jacob Dawson. I run the Dawson Ranch out west of town about 8 miles. I've got approximately 160 men working that operation at any given point, and no cook. My last one left 3 weeks back, and the situation has become something of a problem. Hannah looked at him. I'm listening. I'm not a man who has a gift for making things sound better than they are, Jacob Dawson said, so I'll just say it plain. I need a cook. Someone who can manage a kitchen for a working ranch breakfast before dawn lunch and the field dinner at the house. It's not a small job and it's not easy work. He paused. Can you cook? Hannah was quiet for a moment. Around them, the platform had gone rather noticeably still. The women from the dry goods store were absolutely not pretending to look elsewhere anymore. My mother taught me to cook before I could read, Hannah said. I've been running a kitchen since I was 14. What kind of cooking? Everything you can make from a root cellar and a wood stove, she said. Bread biscuits, stew, roast pie, preserved soup beans, cornbread, salt pork. I can stretch a small amount of meat into a meal for 12, and I can make a decent Sunday dinner when there's more to work with. I've fed harvest hands, and I've fed my family through 2 bad winters. Jacob Dawson nodded once, slowly. The position comes with a room in the main house, 3 meals for yourself, and $6 a month. He paused again. I should tell you I have 2 children. A daughter 9 years old. A son 13. Their mother passed 3 years ago. They're good children. But they haven't had a woman in the house since their mother. Hannah looked at him for a long, careful moment. She was thinking about $62 and Wyoming winters, and what it would cost to stay in the town hotel while she figured out another plan. She was thinking about her mother's voice, saying braver than you know. She was thinking in a way she couldn't have fully articulated that this man had walked across a train platform to offer something to a woman he didn't know and had no obligation toward, and that the way he held his hat while he did it told her something about him that 6 letters from Brad Collins never had. I'll need to see this kitchen before I agree to anything, Hannah said. Jacob Dawson looked at her. Then the thing at the corner of his mouth became something more definite. That's fair, he said. One of the men standing behind him, a broad, red-faced fellow with the look of a foreman, made a sound that might have been a smothered laugh. Jacob shot him a look, and the sound stopped. My wagon's just down the street, Jacob said. He put his hat back on. If you're ready. Hannah picked up her suitcase and stood. She was aware with some satisfaction that every person remaining on that platform was watching her go, and that none of them had expected this particular ending to the scene. She didn't look back at any of them. She didn't look back at the spot where Brad Collins had stood. She walked beside Jacob Dawson off the platform and down the wooden boards of the main street, and she told herself to take the next hour as it came, and the hour after that, and not to think yet about anything larger. The wagon was a working wagon, not a fancy one, solid and practical with a canvas cover against the weather. The 2 men who'd been standing behind Jacob climbed up to the driver's bench, and Jacob helped Hannah up into the back without ceremony, which she appreciated. She didn't need ceremony. She needed to think. Those are my men, Jacob said, settling across from her in the wagon bed. Pete Gallagher, the red-headed one, he's my foreman. Been with me 15 years. The other one's Danny Walsh, good with horses. How long has the ranch been in operation? Hannah asked. My father built it. I took it over when I was 22. He said it without particular pride or modesty, just as a fact. We run about 4,000 head of cattle, wheat and corn for the feed, some for market. We've got a bunkhouse that holds 40 men and 3 additional barracks for the rest. And your children, Hannah said. Where are they during the day? Something shifted in his face. Just briefly, just a tightening around the eyes. Emma's with Mrs. Ecott, the wife of my East foreman most days. She's been kind enough to take her in the mornings. Lucas works alongside the men. He insisted on it after his mother died, and He stopped. I let him. Maybe I shouldn't have. How old was he when she died? 10. Hannah did the arithmetic and said nothing. The wagon moved through Milford and out onto the open road west, and Hannah looked at the land for the first time, really looked at it without the distraction of platforms and humiliation and immediate crisis. It was enormous in a way she had not fully prepared herself for. The sky was bigger than any sky she'd seen, vast and pale and cold, pressing down on a landscape of frozen grass and distant ridges, and the particular loneliness of open ground in winter. It was not beautiful the way Ohio valleys were beautiful. It was beautiful the way things are when they are exactly and entirely what they are without apology. "It's very large," Hannah said. "You get used to it," Jacob said. "I don't know if that's true," Hannah said. "I think some things you just learn to stand inside." He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded like she'd said something worth considering. The Dawson Ranch came into view about 40 minutes later, and Hannah took it in as they approached the main house, 2 stories built solid and without pretension, smoke rising from 2 chimneys. The bunkhouse and barracks off to the east, a long, low structure that could have housed a small village. Barns paddocks. A blacksmith shed storage buildings, all of it connected by a network of well-worn paths. It was a working place. Everything about it said work, from the way it sat on the land, to the way the fences were maintained tight and purposeful, with no wasted lumber. The wagon pulled up to the main house, and Pete Gallagher jumped down, with the ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Jacob climbed out and offered his hand to Hannah, and she took it and stepped down with her suitcase. The front door opened before they reached it, and a small figure erupted onto the porch. A girl 9 years old with dark hair coming loose from 2 braids, and an expression of such uninhibited curiosity that Hannah almost smiled before she'd planned to. "Papa," the girl announced. "Mrs. Alcott said I could come home when the wagon came, and I watched from the window, and I've been waiting for ages." She stopped on the porch steps and looked at Hannah with enormous dark eyes that were very obviously her father's. "Is this the new cook?" "Emma," Jacob said with a note in his voice that was not quite a warning. "Manners." "Good afternoon," Emma said, with the concentrated effort of someone deploying manners they find temporarily inconvenient. "Are you the new cook?" "I haven't decided yet," Hannah said. "I need to see the kitchen first." Emma's eyes went wide. "You haven't decided, you might say no." "People have choices," Hannah said. "It's polite to exercise them before committing." Emma stared at her. Then she turned and pushed the front door open wider. "The kitchen's in the back. I'll show you." Jacob caught Hannah's eye briefly as they went up the steps. She couldn't read exactly what was in his face, but it was something in the neighborhood of surprised and possibly underneath that something cautiously like hope. The inside of the house was clean, but had the particular quality of a space that was maintained rather than lived in. The furniture was good, and the floors were swept, and everything was in its place. But there was nothing soft about it. No flowers, no curtains that weren't purely functional, no particular color anywhere. It was a house that had had its warmth removed and hadn't found a way to get it back. Hannah noticed this the way she noticed most things, practically without sentiment, cataloging it for information. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and the moment she stepped into it, she felt the particular sensation of recognizing something. It was a good kitchen, a serious kitchen. A long iron stove with 6 burners and 2 ovens. A large center table of thick-cut pine scarred with use. Shelves along the entire east wall with room for substantial stores. A root cellar door set into the floor, iron-ringed. 2 good windows facing south. A water pump inside rather than outside, which was a considerable advantage. Hooks for every size of pot and pan, and there were good pots and pans hanging from them. The problem was immediately visible. The stores were low, not empty, but nowhere near where they should be for a ranch of this size in mid-January. There were beans and dried corn, and some flour that needed to be checked, a side of salt pork, a handful of dried herbs that had lost most of their potency, and almost nothing else. "What happened to the supplies?" Hannah asked. "Fletcher, the last cook. He wasn't careful with the accounts," Jacob said from the doorway. He'd leaned against the frame, arms crossed, watching her. "We've been managing on what the men could throw together. It hasn't been—" "No, I can see it hasn't," Hannah said. She was opening the flour bin, checking for weevils, checking the consistency. The flour was acceptable. She moved to the salt pork. "When does your supply wagon go out next?" "I can send it tomorrow morning. I'll need to write you a list tonight." He looked at her. "So you're staying?" Hannah turned away from the shelves and looked at him directly. "The stove is exceptional, and the kitchen has good bones. The stores are a problem, but a solvable one. The root cellar." She lifted the iron ring and looked down. There were potatoes, some of them soft, but most still good, and several jars of what appeared to be preserved tomatoes and one of pickles. Better than I expected. Yes, I'm staying. She let the cellar door down gently. $6 a month and a room in the house and meals as we discussed. Agreed, Jacob said. I'll start tomorrow morning. Tonight I want to look through what we have and think about the week's menu. Tonight you should probably... He stopped. You've been on a train for 3 days, Miss Carter. I know, Hannah said. I'll sleep once I've looked through the stores. She met his eyes. Mr. Dawson, I've just arrived in a place I've never been, in a situation I didn't plan for, and the only thing I have at the moment that I can actually do anything about is this kitchen. Please let me do something about it. There was a silence. Jacob Dawson looked at her for a long moment with those dark, serious eyes, and then he pushed off the doorframe and said, I'll have someone bring hot water up for the room at the top of the stairs. It's the one on the left, and I'll tell the men there'll be something proper for breakfast tomorrow morning. He left. Emma, who had been lurking near the kitchen door with enormous curiosity, stayed behind. He told the men yesterday there'd be something proper for breakfast, and then it was just more beans, Emma said. What's wrong with beans? Hannah said. Emma looked at her with deep expressiveness. Nothing, if you're a bean. Hannah looked at the girl for a moment. Do you know what's in the cold pantry? There's some eggs, Emma said, from yesterday, and I think there's butter. How many eggs? Maybe 12, I didn't count exactly. Hannah turned back to the shelves and started taking a real inventory, noting everything in the careful mental ledger she'd been keeping since she was old enough to understand what it meant to feed people through a winter. Behind her, she heard Emma settle onto the stool near the center table without being asked, which meant the child had been lonely enough for company that she was willing to keep company, even with a stranger doing inventory. What's your name? Emma asked. Hannah Carter. I'm Emma Dawson. A pause. My mama's name was Rose. That's a beautiful name, Hannah said. I know, Emma said. Papa doesn't talk about her much anymore. Lucas says it's because it hurts him. But I think sometimes you have to talk about people, even when it hurts, don't you? Because if you stop talking about them, then the not talking hurts more. Hannah stopped what she was doing for just a moment. Then she kept going. I think that's very wise, she said. I'm 9, Emma said. I think wise things sometimes. I believe you, Hannah said. She heard the front door open and close, and then heavy boots on the floorboards, and a voice she didn't recognize saying something to Jacob in a low tone. Then silence. Then Jacob's voice from somewhere in the front of the house, saying something to someone about the supply order, his voice calm and businesslike. Emma had gotten down from the stool and come to stand beside Hannah at the shelves, looking at the inventory, with her small head tilted. Can you really make something good out of all this? Tomorrow morning, Hannah said. I'm going to make biscuits from that flour, and I'm going to fry those eggs in good butter, and I'm going to make a gravy from the drippings in that pan, she pointed. And your father's men are going to eat breakfast like men who are worth feeding. And then we'll see about the rest. Emma looked at the pan. She looked at the flour. She looked at Hannah. Mrs. Alcott makes biscuits sometimes, she said, but they come out like rocks. Not mine, Hannah said. How do you know? Because I've never made a bad biscuit in my life, Hannah said, and I don't intend to start now. Emma stared at her with those enormous dark eyes. Then for the first time since Hannah had arrived, the child smiled, not the polite company smile of a well-trained child, but a real one startled out of her by surprise, and it transformed her face entirely. Hannah made note of it and went back to the inventory. She was up past midnight sitting at the kitchen table by lamplight, with a piece of paper and a pencil writing out the supply list and the week's menu and the priorities in order of urgency. She could hear the house around her, the settling of timber in the cold, the sound of wind off the range, the distant low sounds from the bunkhouse. It was not a silent place, this ranch. It had its own voice, low and constant and working. She thought about Brad Collins once briefly while she was writing. She thought about the platform and the woman in the green dress and the word inconvenience. She felt the thing again that had wanted to come up through her chest, and she noted it, and she let it be there, and she kept writing. She had not come 3,000 miles to fall apart on someone else's kitchen floor. She had come 3,000 miles, and she had arrived, and she was going to make biscuits in the morning that would make men think about home, and she was going to figure out the rest after that. Upstairs, she could hear a door open and quiet footsteps and the sound of a window being checked against the cold. Jacob Dawson doing the last rounds of the night, the way a man does when a house is his responsibility, and he takes that seriously. The footsteps paused outside the kitchen door for a moment. Hannah kept writing. Then the footsteps moved on up the stairs, and the house went quiet again. She finished the list at midnight and read it through once and folded it neatly and set it on the table for morning. Then she went to the root cellar one more time and pulled out 6 of the best potatoes and set them to soak overnight. Breakfast first, then the rest. She climbed the stairs to the room on the left, which was plain and clean and cold, and had a good thick quilt on the bed, and she took off her coat and her boots and lay down and looked at the ceiling in the dark. She was alive. She was employed. She had a kitchen. She thought, now what? But this time, for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, she thought it differently. Not with desperation. With something that was not quite yet determination, but was moving steadily in that direction. She was asleep inside of 2 minutes. She woke before 4, as she always did, in the black dark, before any light had thought about arriving, and she lay still for 3 seconds, listening to the house, and then she got up. By the time the first ranch hand came stumbling toward the cookhouse at 5:30, there was light in the kitchen window of the main house, and the smell coming from it was bread. Real bread, yeasty and warm, and beneath it, the smell of coffee, strong and honest, and beneath that, the smell of something frying in butter that made the half-asleep man stop walking entirely and just stand in the cold morning dark and breathe it in. By 6 o'clock, Pete Gallagher had come to the kitchen door to investigate. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the table, which had a pan of biscuits resting on a cloth and a pot of gravy on the stove, and a skillet of fried eggs with their edges just crisped in butter, and he said very quietly, "Lord Almighty." "Is that a compliment or a prayer?" Hannah said without turning from the stove. "Both," Pete said. Jacob came downstairs at 6:15 and stopped at the kitchen door, the same way Pete had stopped, with a stillness that was not about the food exactly, or not entirely about the food. Hannah was moving between the stove and the table, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times and expected to do it 10,000 more. And the kitchen was warm, genuinely warm for the first time in weeks, from the look of Pete's face, and there was a small figure at the end of the table. Emma, who had appeared at 5:30 in her nightgown, asking if she could help, and had been set to folding napkins, of which there turned out to be a surprising number in a drawer Hannah had found. "Morning," Hannah said to Jacob. "Morning," Jacob said. He looked at Emma, who had napkins in a neat pile, and was eating a small biscuit with an expression of concentrated bliss. "You're up early," he said to his daughter. "Hannah needed help," Emma said. "I folded napkins," Emma added, as though this required clarification. Jacob looked at the kitchen, the warmth, the food, the smell, the small girl at the table, the napkins, and something moved through his face that he didn't seem entirely prepared for. He looked away. He said, "I'll tell the men to eat in shifts, 20 at a time." "I made enough for 40 in the first round," Hannah said. "Send them all." He looked at her. "You made enough for 40. I estimated the number and planned accordingly," Hannah said. "The biscuits will hold. The gravy's on low. Send them." There was a moment where Jacob Dawson looked at Hannah Carter, standing at his stove in his kitchen, making breakfast for 40 men, as though it were the most straightforward thing she'd done all week, which it more or less was, and the expression on his face was something Hannah didn't have a name for yet, but would eventually come to recognize. He sent the men. They came in shifts, and the kitchen held them, and the biscuits held, and the gravy held, and the eggs ran out after 30. But Hannah had anticipated that, and the potato hash she'd made from last night's soaking filled the rest of it. And when it was over, and the last man had gone back to his work, Pete Gallagher came back to the kitchen door and said with a directness that seemed characteristic of him, "Miss Carter, I don't know where you came from, and I don't know what you're doing here, but I want you to know that those men just ate a real breakfast for the first time in 3 weeks, and there's not a one of them that won't work better for it today." Hannah was already washing the pans. "Tell me something useful," she said. "What do they miss most? Most from home, I mean. What did their mothers make that they think about?" Pete blinked. It was clearly not the response he'd expected. He thought about it seriously for a moment, which she appreciated. "Pie," he said finally. "Tom Briggs talks about his mother's apple pie every time apple season comes around. Jenkins is always going on about salt-cured ham. And old Roberts, he's been on this ranch 12 years. He once told me his grandmother made a molasses bread that he's never found again anywhere." "Molasses bread," Hannah said. "I can do that." She paused. "Not today, but this week if the supply wagon comes back with what I need." Pete looked at her for another moment. Then he said very simply, "Thank you, miss," and put his hat back on and went back to work. Hannah washed the rest of the pans. Emma had fallen asleep at the table with her head on her folded arms, the napkins still in a neat pile beside her. Hannah looked at her for a moment, then lifted the child carefully. She was lighter than she should have been, and carried her to the small settee in the front room, and laid her down, and went back to the kitchen. She heard heavy footsteps on the staircase, and then Jacob in the front room very quietly, and then silence, and then his footsteps heading back toward the kitchen door. "She fell asleep," Hannah said before he could speak. "I see that," Jacob said. His voice was different, lower, rougher at the edges. She doesn't sleep anywhere but her room." "She got up at 5:30, Hannah said. "She was tired." "She talked to you," Jacob said. "This morning. I could hear her from upstairs." "She has a lot to say," Hannah said. "She hasn't had much to say lately," Jacob said. "Not to anyone." He stopped. He was standing in the kitchen doorway again, and he looked for just a moment like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had just shifted it slightly on his shoulder, not put it down, just shifted it. "Lucas will be out with the East crew today," he said. "He won't come in for dinner. He eats with the men." "I'll send something out with the food wagon," Hannah said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Hannah said, and went back to the inventory she'd been updating. "I want to know what he likes. Can you tell me, or should I ask Pete?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He likes cornbread. His mother used to make it with honey." "I'll need molasses or honey, whichever the supply wagon can get." "I'll add it to the list," Jacob said. "I already did," Hannah said. There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Then Jacob said, "I'll be in the East barn until midday if you need anything." "I won't need anything," Hannah said, "but thank you." He left. Hannah heard his boots cross the front room pause near the settee where Emma was sleeping, and then the front door opened and closed. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet. The real quiet, not the desperate quiet of the train platform, but the working quiet of a house that had things being done inside it. The stove ticked and settled. The wind came off the range and pressed against the south windows. Somewhere outside a horse made a sound, and a man made a sound back at it low and calm. Hannah Carter put her pencil behind her ear and got back to work. She had bread to start for the afternoon, and a stew to plan with whatever the root cellar could contribute, and a kitchen to fully understand before the day was out. She had a list of supplies that needed to reach this house by Friday, or the weekend menu was going to require creativity. She had a 9-year-old asleep on the settee who would be hungry when she woke up and would almost certainly want to help with the bread. She had a 13-year-old out in the East fields who liked cornbread with honey, and who had decided at age 10 that work was better than grief, and had been paying for that decision ever since. She had a ranch of 160 men who had just eaten a real breakfast for the first time in 3 weeks. She had for the moment everything she needed. She rolled up her sleeves and started the bread. The supply wagon came back Friday afternoon with everything on Hannah's list, and she was standing in the kitchen doorway when Pete Gallagher drove it in, checking items against the paper in her hand before the horses had fully stopped. 50 pounds of good flour, salt pork in quantity, dried beans, cornmeal lard molasses, a crate of winter apples that were soft in spots, but workable coffee enough to last the month, and because she had written it in clear letters at the bottom of the list, 2 pounds of stick cinnamon and a jar of good vanilla extract, which Pete had apparently questioned, and which someone she suspected Jacob had told him to get anyway. "Everything's here," she said. "Took some doing on the cinnamon," Pete said, climbing down from the wagon bench. "Hargrove at the dry goods store said nobody out this way buys cinnamon in quantity." "They will now," Hannah said, and went inside to start making room. She had spent the 3 days since her arrival learning the kitchen the way you learn any serious thing, by doing it in every condition and at every hour, by finding out where it was generous and where it was difficult, by understanding its particular rhythms. The stove ran hot on the left side and needed watching after the first hour. The root cellar was colder than the ideal for potatoes, and she'd moved the best ones to a shelf near the stove. The water pump stiffened in the early morning cold and needed 2 hard primes before it flowed. The bread shelf on the east wall got good morning light, which helped the dough rise. She knew these things now. This kitchen was hers, and she was learning to speak its language. What she had also been learning in those 3 days was the ranch itself, not the land or the operations which were Jacob's domain, but the human architecture of the place. The way certain men came early to breakfast because the bunkhouse was cold and the kitchen was warm, and they needed 5 quiet minutes before the day started. The way old Robert's 12 years on this ranch, Pete had said, always stood near the door, rather than sitting, a habit of a man who had once been free-ranging and had never entirely made peace with enclosed spaces. The way Danny Walsh, the young one who was good with horses, saved half his cornbread every meal, and Hannah had initially thought he was wasting it until she noticed him feeding it to the old mare in the east paddock every afternoon without fail. She noticed these things because her mother had taught her that feeding people well meant knowing them at least a little. You couldn't cook for ghosts. You cooked for people, and people had specific needs and specific griefs and specific things that made them feel for a moment like the world was manageable. She had been in Milford, Wyoming for 72 hours, and she had already made old Roberts's molasses bread, a rich, dense loaf with a dark crust that she'd found the recipe for in her own memory, close enough to what Pete had described that when she set it on the table. Thursday morning, Roberts had gone very still and then eaten 3 slices without speaking, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were wet and he said, "My grandmother made this," and Hannah said, "I know," and he hadn't said another word, but he'd been the first man at the table every morning since. Emma had been in the kitchen every day. Hannah had given her real tasks, not keep the child busy tasks, but actual work. Measuring flour, rolling dough, learning the difference between bread dough, which needed muscle, and biscuit dough, which needed restraint. Emma had a natural instinct for baking that Hannah recognized from her own childhood, a feeling for when something was right, an ability to pay attention with her hands. She made mistakes, and she took correction without drama, and she tried again, which were the 3 most important qualities a person could have in a kitchen. She had not yet met Lucas properly. She'd seen him across the yard in the mornings, heading out with the East crew before breakfast, not coming in. Pete had mentioned without being asked that Lucas had eaten with the men since he was 11, and that Jacob had let it go because the boy needed something to anchor himself to after his mother died, and work had been it. Hannah had sent cornbread with honey on the food wagon Thursday and Friday, and had gotten no direct response, which was fine. She wasn't trying to win anyone. She was trying to do her job, and doing her job well was the only argument worth making. It was Saturday morning when it changed. She was at the stove at 5:45, getting the first round of biscuits into the oven, when she heard the front door open and close, and footsteps that were not Jacob's and not Pete's. Lighter than Jacob, heavier than Emma. A teenager's walk, still figuring out how much space it occupied in the world. She kept her back to the door and kept working. "There's coffee on the left side of the stove," she said. "Mugs are on the second shelf." A silence. Then the footsteps came into the kitchen and stopped. She heard the sound of a mug being taken down, of the coffee pot being lifted. "The cornbread on Thursday," a voice said. It was low for 13 working toward the register. It would eventually settle into. "Was that the honey from the supply wagon?" "Yes," Hannah said. "We didn't have any before that." Another silence. She turned the biscuits and closed the oven. She heard him pour his coffee, and then she heard him sit down at the kitchen table, not standing near the door like he was ready to leave, sitting, which was something different. It was good, Lucas said. "The cornbread." "Thank you," Hannah said. "My mother made it with honey," he said, and his voice stayed steady, but she could hear what it cost him to keep it that way. "I know," Hannah said. "Your father told me. Papa told you about her cooking. He told me you liked cornbread with honey. That was enough for me to understand." She turned from the stove and looked at him for the first time directly. He was tall for 13, with his father's dark eyes, and something around the jaw that was going to be Jacob's jaw in 10 years, and he was holding his coffee mug with both hands, the way people do when they're cold, or when they need something to hold. He was wearing working clothes already at 5:45 in the morning. "You're up early," she said. "I'm always up early," he said. "I check on the horses before the day starts." "Your father know you do that." "It was his idea," Lucas said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite pride, but was adjacent to it. The satisfaction of a boy who has been given real responsibility and takes it seriously. Hannah went back to the stove. "I'm making enough biscuits for 60 this morning. You can eat here, or with the men, whichever you prefer." How was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I'll eat here." She didn't make anything of it. She just handed him the butter dish from the shelf and said, "First batch is in 12 minutes, and went back to work. When Jacob came downstairs at 6, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and found his son sitting at the table eating a biscuit with butter and talking to Hannah. Actually talking. Not the monosyllabic reports he gave his father, but talking, explaining to her the difference between the East Paddock horses and the West Paddock horses in terms of temperament, and how you had to approach each one differently. And Hannah was listening while she worked and asking questions that were real questions, not the placating kind adults ask children when they're not actually listening. Jacob stood in the doorway for a moment, and Hannah caught his eye over Lucas's head, and Jacob's face did that thing again, the thing she didn't have a name for, the thing that was something more than surprise, and something less than what it would eventually become. He sat down at the table without saying anything about it, and Emma appeared 7 minutes later in her nightgown and braids, and the four of them ate breakfast in the kitchen while the sky outside lightened from black to gray, and nobody said anything remarkable, which was itself remarkable. The first rumor reached Hannah on Tuesday. She heard it from Emma, who heard it from Mrs. Alcott, who heard it from someone's wife in town, who had apparently been discussing the situation with considerable enthusiasm. The gist of it was this: the abandoned Ohio bride had landed on her feet by attaching herself to the wealthiest widower in the county. And wasn't that convenient? And didn't that say something about her character? And wasn't Jacob Dawson too good a man to see what was happening right under his own nose? Emma reported this information at the kitchen table, with the particular combination of outrage and bewilderment that 9-year-olds bring to adult hypocrisy. Mrs. Alcott said she didn't believe it, Emma said. But she said it in the way that means she kind of does. "People will talk," Hannah said. She was making pie crust, which required cold hands and a light touch and most of her attention. "But it's not true," Emma said. "No," Hannah said. "You're the cook," Emma said. "That's all. Papa hired you because we needed one." "I know that," Hannah said. "You know that. Your father knows that. The rest of it will sort itself out." "What if it doesn't sort itself out? What if they keep saying it?" Hannah set down the rolling pin and looked at Emma directly. "Then they keep saying it, and I keep doing my job, and in a year, everyone will know exactly what I am and what I'm not, and all the talk will have been for nothing. That's usually how it goes." Emma considered this. "That seems like it takes a long time." "Most worthwhile things do," Hannah said, and picked the rolling pin back up. But she was not as settled as she sounded, and she knew it. The rumors were not nothing in a small town. In a small county, reputation was the only currency that lasted, and a woman who arrived as a mail-order bride and ended up as the cook for the man who rejected her was exactly the kind of story that people shaped to fit their existing assumptions. There was nothing she could do about the story, except be visibly, consistently, undeniably what she actually was: a cook, an employee, a woman doing an honest job. She made the apple pies that afternoon, 3 of them, with the soft winter apples and the cinnamon she'd insisted on, with a lattice top that she cut with a knife, and laid with the mechanical precision of someone who had done it too many times to count. The smell that came off those pies when she pulled them from the oven at 4 in the afternoon was the kind of smell that travels, that gets into the walls and the curtains and the coats hanging by the door and stays there for days. And Pete Gallagher, who happened to be walking through the front room to find Jacob stopped dead in his tracks and stood very still, the way a man does when something bypasses his mind entirely and goes straight to some older part of him. "Is that?" he started. "Apple pie," Hannah said from the kitchen. "It'll be cold by dinner if no one interferes with it." Pete put his hat on and went to find Jacob with a different quality of urgency than he'd had before. Jacob came in from the barn at 5:30 and stood in the kitchen with his hat in his hands and said very carefully, "The men are going to want to know if this is going to be a regular occurrence." "If the supply wagon keeps bringing apples," Hannah said, "then yes. I'll make sure it does," Jacob said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he said, as if it had just occurred to him, "You didn't have to do this. The pies. It wasn't on the weekly menu." "No," Hannah agreed. "But Roberts told me this morning that Tom Briggs hasn't been sleeping. He's been worrying about his wife back in Colorado. She's expecting their first child, and he can't get back until spring, and the worry is eating him alive." She paused. "I can't fix that. But I can make him think about home in a way that's kind instead of just painful. Sometimes that's enough." Jacob looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly, "My wife used to say something like that. That cooking was a form of care." "She was right," Hannah said, and meant it simply without anything behind it except agreement. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went back to work. The following Thursday was the first real test. It had been cold all week. Not the light Wyoming cold that Hannah was beginning to adjust to, but a deep, mean cold that came down off the northern range and stayed dropping temperatures low enough that the water pump in the kitchen needed 3 primes instead of 2, and the men working outside came in for meals with a stiffness in their faces that was more than tiredness. Over 30 men had been working a section of fence on the north boundary, repairing damage from a November storm, and the cold had slowed the work and shortened tempers, and by Thursday noon, the bunkhouse was crackling with the particular friction of tired men who had run out of patience with each other. Hannah heard about it from Danny Walsh, who came in for the midday meal, looking like a man who had narrowly avoided a fight. "Jenkins and Briggs nearly came to blows over the fence post allocation," he said. "Pete had to step in. Jenkins threw a bucket." "Was anyone hurt?" "Just the bucket," Danny said. "But it's bad out there. Everyone's cold and nobody's slept enough, and Briggs is half out of his mind with worry about his wife and—" He stopped. "Sorry, miss, not your problem." "What would help?" Hannah said. "Right now, today at the midday meal, what would make those men feel better for an hour?" Danny blinked. I don't know. Something hot." "I have hot," Hannah said. "What else?" he thought. Something that takes a long time. Something that says somebody put work into it." He paused. "My mother made beef stew on bad days. She said it was the smell more than the food. Like if you walk in from the cold and something smells like it's been cooking since morning, it means somebody thought about you before you got there." Hannah was already moving. She had started the stew 2 hours before because she'd felt the cold shift in the night, and she planned ahead. She pulled the lid off the pot and looked at it. The beef had broken down into tenderness. The onions had dissolved into the broth. The potatoes were giving off their starch and thickening everything, and the smell that came up from it was exactly what Danny had described. "Somebody thought about you before you got there." She added the last of the black pepper and a handful of dried parsley. She pulled 6 loaves of bread from the oven. Dark brown, thick, crusted, the kind that holds up to being torn with cold hands. She set the table in the large dining room off the kitchen. For the first time since she'd arrived, the men had been eating in the bunkhouse and the cookhouse, not in the main house, and she put everything out properly, the bread and the butter and the bowls, and she sent Emma to tell Pete to send the men in shifts. When Jenkins and Briggs came in together, still not looking at each other, and sat down at opposite ends of the table, and the stew went into their bowls, and the bread came around, and the smell of it got into the room and stayed there. Hannah watched from the kitchen door. She watched Jenkins pick up his bread and tear it, and she watched Briggs wrap both hands around his bowl the way Danny had described, and she watched the stiffness come out of both their shoulders in the space of about 3 minutes. By the end of the meal, Jenkins had passed Briggs the butter without being asked, and Briggs had said something low that made Jenkins make a sound that was close to a laugh, and it wasn't peace exactly. It was the precondition of peace, the small clearing of space where peace might grow if nothing knocked it over. Pete Gallagher came in last. After all the men had eaten and sat down at the table, and looked at Hannah with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of astonishment. "Whatever you did," he said, "you can do it every Thursday." "I didn't do anything," Hannah said. "I just made lunch." "Miss Carter," Pete said, "in 15 years on this ranch, I have never seen Jenkins pass anything to Briggs without an argument." Hannah picked up the empty bread basket and took it back to the kitchen. The twist she hadn't expected came that evening when Jacob called her into the front room after dinner. He was standing by the fireplace with a piece of paper in his hand and an expression that was careful and complicated, and Hannah came in from the kitchen and stopped when she saw his face. "Sit down," he said. Then, as if he'd heard how that sounded, "Please, if you don't mind." She sat. He stayed standing. He looked at the paper and then at her, and then he said, "I had a letter from Brad Collins today." The name hit her somewhere behind the sternum, not with grief, but with the sharp shock of the unexpected. She kept her face neutral. "All right. He's heard you're working here," Jacob said. "He's heard about you. What you've done here in 2 weeks." The men talk when they go to town, and apparently quite a bit of what they say involves the food. He stopped. "He's calling it a scheme." "A scheme," Hannah repeated. "He's telling people—" Jacob's jaw tightened. "He's telling people that you arranged this, that you knew you'd be rejected and you planned to use the rejection to get yourself placed in my household." The silence in the room was complete. Hannah looked at Jacob Dawson and thought with the clarity she brought to most things about what this moment was and what it was not. It was not a question about whether she was guilty. She could see that in his face he was not asking her because he suspected her. He was asking her because he was angry on her behalf and didn't know what to do with that anger. "Do you believe that?" she said. "No," Jacob said immediately. "Not for 1 second." "Then the only thing to consider is what he's going to do with it," Hannah said. "Is he intending to spread it further?" "The letter suggests he's already begun," Jacob said. He set the paper down. "I want to respond to him. I want to—" He stopped again. "I'd like your permission before I do." That surprised her. She looked at him more carefully. "You're asking my permission. You're the one being slandered," Jacob said. "It's your name. I'm not going to charge into it without knowing what you want." Hannah was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night wind was up. Inside, the fire made its quiet sound. Somewhere upstairs, Emma was reading. Hannah could hear the occasional creak of the bed as she shifted, and Lucas had gone up an hour ago after sitting at the kitchen table doing figures for the east fence, accounting that Pete had asked him to help with, because Lucas, it turned out, was remarkable with numbers. "Tell him," Hannah said, "that I'm employed on this ranch in a legitimate capacity, and that any attempt to misrepresent that will be answered directly." She paused. "Don't threaten him. Just be clear." Jacob nodded slowly. "That's what I'll say. And Mr. Dawson?" She stood. "For what it's worth, I did not plan to be standing in that station. I did not plan any of this. I came 3,000 miles in good faith to a man who turned out not to deserve it. And I've spent the 2 weeks since then doing the only thing I know how to do, which is to feed people well and hope it counts for something. That's all." "I know," Jacob said. "I'm not sure you entirely do," Hannah said, not unkindly. "But you will." She went back to the kitchen to start the bread for the morning. She heard him sit down heavily in the chair by the fire after she left, and she heard him stay there for a long time. The second week stretched into the third, and the rhythm of the ranch began to absorb Hannah the way any strong current absorbs something moving at speed, not all at once, but steadily, until the current and the thing moving through it are going the same direction. She woke before 4. She started the stove. She planned the day's meals against the supplies. She made bread on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday cornbread on Tuesday and Thursday. She made soup every day because in a Wyoming winter, soup was not a luxury, it was a mechanism. She made biscuits every morning because biscuits in quantity made well were the closest thing she knew to a universal language. She started teaching Emma properly. Not just folding napkins or measuring real cooking, the kind that started from an understanding of why things worked the way they did. She explained the chemistry of bread in terms simple enough for a 9-year-old without being condescending. She showed her how fat affected texture, why salt mattered, how heat transformed things from one state into another. Emma absorbed it with the intensity of a child who had found the thing she was built for, which Hannah recognized because she had found the same thing at roughly the same age. "Did your mother teach you like this?" Emma asked one afternoon, both of them elbow deep in bread dough. "She taught me everything I know," Hannah said. "Do you miss her?" "Every day," Hannah said. "She's still alive. She's back in Ohio. But I miss her the way you miss people who are too far away to touch." Emma worked the dough for a moment. "Lucas misses Mama like that," she said. "But he can't say it out loud because it makes Papa sad, and he doesn't want to make Papa sad, so he just works instead." Hannah kept her hands moving. "What about you?" "I cry sometimes when nobody's looking," Emma said with the candor of someone very young who has not yet learned that honesty can be inconvenient. "In the barn, mostly because nobody goes there except Lucas and the horses, and neither of them tells." "That's very practical of you," Hannah said. "I know," Emma said, pleased. Then after a pause, "Is it okay to be sad and happy at the same time? Because I'm sad she's gone, but I like that you're here. And sometimes those two feelings are right next to each other, and I don't know if that's wrong." Hannah stopped and looked at Emma directly. The girl was watching her with those enormous dark eyes, genuinely wanting to know. And Hannah thought about her mother, and about Ohio, and about train platforms, and about what it meant to find yourself somewhere you hadn't planned to be, and discover that the place needed you. "Those feelings are supposed to be next to each other," Hannah said. "They're not opposites. Love doesn't stop when someone's gone. It just gets quieter. And there's always room for new things beside it, not instead of it. Always." Emma considered this with the serious attention she gave to most things that mattered. Then she went back to the bread dough and didn't say anything else. But when Jacob came in 20 minutes later and found both of them at the table with flour to their elbows, and Emma explaining to Hannah with considerable authority that the East Stallion had a different personality in the mornings than the afternoons, he stood in the doorway again. Hannah looked at him. He looked at his daughter. His face did the thing, and this time Hannah let herself see it for what it was. A man watching something return to his house that he had believed was gone for good. She looked away. The night it changed, with Lucas, happened on a Thursday. In the third week, when the temperature dropped past what was ordinary, and stayed there. And a rider came in from the north pasture at 9 in the evening to tell Pete that 3 of the younger cattle had gone through a thin patch of ice on the East Creek, and that the men trying to get them out were going to need to work through the night. Pete got Jacob, and Jacob got the men, and within 20 minutes, half the ranch was mobilizing in the dark and the cold, and Hannah was already at the stove. She didn't ask permission. She pulled the flour and the lard and the dried beans and the salt pork, and she started building the largest batch of camp food she'd made in her life. A pot of bean and pork soup that could sit on low heat, indefinitely. 2 sheet pans of biscuits she could remake in batches. Coffee in the biggest pot the kitchen had. Lucas came through the kitchen on his way out with the men pulling on his coat, and stopped when he saw what she was doing. "You don't have to," he started. "I know," Hannah said. "Go help your father. I'll have food when you come back in." He started for the door again. Then he stopped, and without turning around he said, "The men on the night crew, they take their coffee with more sugar than the day crew. 2 spoons instead of 1. Papa takes his black. Pete takes it with just a little, not much." Hannah looked at his back. "Good to know," she said. "Thank you." He went out into the dark. She cooked through the night. Emma slept upstairs. The kitchen was warm and the rest of the house was dark, and Hannah stood at the stove in the deep quiet of the small hours and stirred the soup and thought about Ohio and thought about her mother, and did not think about Brad Collins or the rumors or what people said in town, because those things existed at a distance, and the stove was immediate, and the soup was real, and at some point, the only thing you could do with difficulty was meet it with something useful. Jacob came in at 3 in the morning with the ice still on his coat, and his face drawn with cold, and found Hannah at the stove, with a full pot of soup, and the biscuits, keeping warm in the closed oven, and the coffee hot. And he stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her, and she handed him a mug of black coffee without speaking, and he took it with both hands and drank half of it standing there. "The cattle," she said. "2 out," he said. "1 still in the water. Pete and 4 men are still out there." "The soup hold," she said. "Bring the men in rotation." He nodded. Then he said, "You've been here all night." "Yes." "You didn't have to." "Mr. Dawson," Hannah said with a patience that was not impatience, "please stop telling me what I didn't have to do. I'm aware of the boundaries of my employment. I also know that men who work through a Wyoming winter night without food in their bodies are men who make mistakes, and mistakes in that kind of cold cost more than food does. So I cooked." He looked at her for a long, steady moment. Then he said, "All right." "All right," she agreed. I went back out. She refilled her own coffee and went back to the stove. Lucas came in at 4:30 with 3 other men, all of them with the careful movements of people who are exhausted and cold to the center of themselves, and Hannah had bowls on the table before they sat down. Lucas wrapped both hands around his bowl, the same way his father had wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, and she recognized the gesture for what it was. People reaching for warmth. Any warmth when they'd been without it long enough. The third cow came out of the creek at 5:15, and Pete Gallagher came in at 5:30 with snow on his coat and ate 2 bowls of soup and 4 biscuits without stopping. And at 6, Jacob came in last and sat down, and Hannah set food in front of him and sat down at the other end of the table with her own bowl, because she had been standing for 7 hours and her feet had earned a rest. It was the first time she had sat at the table with Jacob. He looked up. She looked at her soup. Then she said, "How's the cow?" "She'll be all right," he said. "Cold rattled. She'll need watching for a few days." "Tom Briggs is good with cattle," Hannah said. "He'll want something to focus on. Give him the cow to watch." Jacob looked at her. "How do you know Briggs is good with cattle?" "He talks about them when he eats," Hannah said. "He talks about the cattle the way other men talk about their wives, with that kind of worry." Jacob made a sound that was close to a laugh, not a full laugh, not yet, but the beginning of one. "You've been paying attention." "That's the job," Hannah said. "You feed people right. You have to know what they need. And knowing what they need means listening." Lucas across the table was watching her with those dark eyes. He hadn't said anything since he came in, but he had not left the table, which was its own statement. "Miss Carter," he said finally. "Lucas, the soup tonight." He paused. He had his father's way with pauses. "My mother made something like it. Before she got sick, she used to make it when it was cold." The kitchen was very quiet. "You don't have to tell me that," Hannah said carefully. "I know," Lucas said. "I wanted to." He picked up his spoon again. "It's good. Different from hers, but good." "Thank you," Hannah said. Jacob was looking at his son with an expression that Hannah did not look at directly, because it felt like something private, something between a father and the ghost of the boy his son had been before grief made him someone harder and quieter. She kept her eyes on her soup. Outside the sun was starting. The sky was the color of iron turning toward light. Hannah got up and went back to the stove to start the morning bread, because the day crew would be up in an hour, and they'd need breakfast, and the night crew would need more coffee before they slept, and there was always more to do. Lucas stayed at the table. He didn't go upstairs. He just sat there with his bowl and his coffee and watched the sky lighten through the kitchen window, and Jacob sat at the other end and let him and Hannah worked at the stove between them, and the kitchen was warm, and the bread dough was rising, and outside the Wyoming cold was exactly what it always was. But inside something had shifted. She couldn't have named it precisely. She wasn't trying to. She had learned in the weeks since she stepped off that train with $62 and a worn suitcase that some things announced themselves, and some things simply happened quietly underneath the surface of ordinary days. And by the time you noticed them, they had already become true. She had not come here to belong anywhere. But something in this kitchen, in this house, in these early mornings with Emma, measuring flour, and these long nights with bread rising, and these meals eaten by men who had been cold too long was becoming, despite everything she had intended, something that felt recognizable. She pressed the dough down and folded it back on itself and pressed it again. The bread would be ready by 7. That was what mattered. That was what she could do. For now, that was enough. The molasses bread had become a Thursday tradition. Hannah hadn't planned it that way. It happened because old Roberts had mentioned on the second Thursday she'd made it that Thursday was the day his grandmother used to bake, and that he hadn't thought about that in 30 years, until the smell came off the oven and put him right back in her kitchen in Missouri, standing at her elbow with flour on his sleeve. Hannah hadn't said anything sentimental about it. She'd just made sure the molasses bread was ready every Thursday from then on, and Roberts knew it without being told. And he was always the first man through the door on Thursday mornings, with his hat in his hands and something careful and grateful in his face. That was how it worked. You paid attention, and you remembered, and you showed up. 4 weeks in Hannah had a working knowledge of every man on the ranch who ate at the main house rotation, which was about 40 of the 160. She knew that Tom Briggs talked too much when he was worried and went silent when he was genuinely afraid, and that the silence was the more dangerous signal. She knew that Danny Walsh's mare, the old one he fed cornbread to every afternoon, was named Grace after his sister back in Tennessee, and that the sister had died of fever the year Danny turned 18, and he'd been moving ever since ranch to ranch, like a man who couldn't find a place that didn't remind him of her absence. She knew that Jenkins, who had thrown the bucket the day Briggs had lost his temper, was actually the first man to check on Briggs after the night shift quietly, without making anything of it, because Jenkins was the kind of man whose gruffness was entirely on the surface, and whose decency was entirely underneath. She knew Jacob took his coffee black, and that he ate less than he should, and that he checked the ranch ledgers every Sunday evening at the kitchen table, because the front room made him think of Rose, and the kitchen was neutral ground. She knew Lucas was afraid of becoming someone who couldn't feel anything, and that the work was armor, and that the armor was starting to come off around the edges slowly in the morning hours when he sat at the kitchen table before the day crew came in and talked to Hannah about the horses, or the fencing, or whatever was in his head, while she made biscuits and didn't make anything of it. She knew Emma was lonely, in a way that was deeper than the ordinary loneliness of children, a loneliness that came from being the only woman-shaped person in a house full of men for 3 years, from growing up without a mother to measure herself against, from having a grief she'd been told implicitly to manage quietly so as not to add to everyone else's. Hannah knew all of this, and she held it carefully, and she cooked. What she had not expected was that her cooking would start to change the town. It started with Briggs. His wife had their baby in February. A boy, healthy mother recovering well, word arriving by letter, that Briggs read at the kitchen table with his hands shaking so badly that he spilled his coffee, and Hannah had set a fresh cup in front of him and said nothing, and let him have the moment in peace. He'd gone to town the following Saturday, his first time in 6 weeks, and he'd come back talking about how the men at the feed store had asked after the ranch, and specifically after the cook, and specifically after whether the apple pie was real, or whether they'd been exaggerating. "What did you say?" Hannah asked. "I said it was real," Briggs said. "And then Henderson from the hardware store said his wife had been hearing about your bread from Mrs. Alcott, and she wanted to know if you ever sold it." Hannah paused. "Sold it? Or gave it away?" "He said she had her baby last month, miss. She's not doing well. Tired. Henderson said she doesn't have the strength to cook, and he doesn't know how, and he's been making her the same 3 things for 4 weeks, and he said, she just cries sometimes when he brings the food in, and he doesn't know if it's because she's grateful or because she's too tired to be anything else." Hannah looked at Briggs for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell Henderson to come by the back door on Friday afternoon. I'll have something for him." Briggs blinked. "You don't have to." "I know," Hannah said. "Friday afternoon." She didn't ask Jacob. She should have. It was his kitchen, his supplies, his household, but she didn't think about it until after, when Jacob came in Friday evening and found her packaging 2 loaves of bread and a jar of preserved tomatoes and a tin of biscuits into a cloth-wrapped bundle on the kitchen table. "Henderson's wife," she said before he could ask. "She had a baby last month and she's struggling. Her husband's going to come by." Jacob looked at the bundle. Then he said, You should add the apple butter. I saw you made a new batch. She looked at him. Top shelf left side, he said, and went upstairs. Henderson came at 4:30, a thin, red-faced man in his early 30s, with the look of someone who had been frightened for a month and hadn't fully stopped being frightened yet. He held the bundle Hannah gave him with both arms, like it was something fragile, and he looked at it, and then at her, and said in a voice that was not entirely steady, "I don't know how to thank you." "Tell her someone was thinking of her," Hannah said. "That's all she needs to know." He nodded. He started to leave. Then he turned back and said, "Miss Carter, what Colin said about you, the things he's been saying in town." He stopped. "There's not a man in Milford who works with his hands who believes a word of it. I want you to know that." Hannah held the door. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson." "My wife's going to want to meet you," he said. "When she's stronger. She's going to want to thank you herself." "When she's ready," Hannah said. "Tell her there's no hurry." She closed the door and stood in the kitchen and let herself feel for just a moment the particular warmth of having done something that mattered. Not a large thing, not a heroic thing, just the right thing in the right direction at the right time. Then she went back to the stove. The twist she hadn't been expecting came not from Brad Collins, though she'd been half watching for that, but from Emma. It was a Sunday in late February, and Hannah was teaching Emma how to make cinnamon rolls, real ones, the kind that required the dough to rise twice, and the filling to be built up in layers, and the patience to wait for the right moment before putting them in, when Emma said without looking up from the dough she was rolling, "Papa looked at you at dinner last night." Hannah kept her hands moving. "People look at each other at dinner. That's what dinner is." "Not like that," Emma said. "He looks at you like he's trying to figure something out." "Your father is a thoughtful man. He looks at most things like that." "He doesn't look at Pete like that," Emma said. "Or at the horses, or at the ledgers." She pressed the dough with her small hands, getting the thickness even the way Hannah had shown her. "He used to look at Mama like that. When I was really little. I remember." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "Emma," Hannah said carefully, "your father hired me to cook. That's what I am here. That's what our situation is." "I know what you are," Emma said with the maddening practicality of a 9-year-old. "I'm just telling you what I see." She looked up. "Is it bad?" "What I said?" "No," Hannah said. "It's not bad, it's just not something to build too much from." Emma considered this, and nodded, and went back to the dough, apparently satisfied, and Hannah went back to the cinnamon filling she was mixing, and tried to return to the business-like steadiness she had been maintaining for 6 weeks with considerable effort. She did not entirely succeed. That same evening, Jacob found her in the kitchen, after the children were in bed, doing the week's accounting. She had taken over the kitchen supply records when she noticed they were being kept in a way that made it impossible to track waste, and Jacob had not argued because the records under her management were materially clearer. He sat down at the other end of the table with the ranch ledgers, and they worked in a silence that had become over the past weeks comfortable in a way that neither of them had named. After a while, Jacob said without looking up from his ledger, "Henderson's wife sent a note." "I heard," Hannah said. "Pete mentioned it. She said the bread was the first thing she'd eaten in a month that made her feel like herself again." Hannah wrote a number in the column. "Good." "She used the word miracle," Jacob said. "It was bread," Hannah said, "not a miracle. The men don't think so." He turned a page. 3 of them asked Pete last week if you were a permanent arrangement, if you were staying." Hannah set her pencil down and looked at him directly. "What did Pete say?" "He said he didn't know." Jacob looked up then. "I didn't give him an answer because I didn't want to assume. $6 a month was the agreement. We didn't discuss duration." The fire in the stove settled. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did at night, pressing against everything, finding every small gap. "Are you asking me to leave?" Hannah said. "No," Jacob said immediately. "The opposite." "Then say the opposite plainly," Hannah said. "I told you in the beginning I preferred plain speech." He looked at her. There was something in his face that she had been carefully not interpreting for 6 weeks. Something that she had classified as employer regard and general gratitude, and let sit there without examining it too closely, because examining it would have required her to examine her own equivalent feeling, which she had also been not doing. "I'd like you to stay," Jacob said. "As long as you're willing. And I'd like to increase the wage. What you're doing here goes well beyond cooking." $8, Hannah said. He blinked. He'd expected negotiation, she could see that, but he'd expected her to name a lower number. $8, he agreed. "And Emma continues her lessons in the kitchen," Hannah said. "That's important to me." "Of course. And when Lucas wants to sit at the kitchen table in the mornings and talk about horses, he talks about horses." She picked up her pencil again. "He needs that. He thinks he's being a burden when he does it, and he's not." Jacob was quiet for a moment. His voice when he spoke was rougher than usual at the edges. "He talks to you about the horses. Every morning for the past 2 weeks. He doesn't talk to me about the horses. He talks to me about them," Hannah said, keeping her voice practical. "Because I'm not his father, and the things that are too loaded to say to your father sometimes need to be said to someone else first. He'll get there. He's already getting there." Jacob put his hand flat on the ledger and looked at it. "I should be doing better by him." "You're doing the best you can," Hannah said. "He knows that. That's why he can't tell you he's struggling, because he doesn't want to add to what you're already carrying." She paused. "The best thing you can do for him right now is let him see you have some capacity left. Show him there's room in you for something besides the work. He's watching everything you do to figure out who he's supposed to become." The silence stretched. The fire ticked. Jacob didn't move his hand from the ledger. "You see a great deal," he said finally. "I cook for people," Hannah said. "It's the same thing." Brad Collins came back into her life on a Thursday in early March, and he came in person. She was at the stove when she heard the knock at the front door. A sharp, confident knock. The knock of a man accustomed to being answered quickly. And she heard Pete's voice, and then another voice. And something in the second voice was familiar enough that she set the spoon down before she'd consciously recognized it. She heard Pete say in a flat tone that was barely civil, "I'll see if Mr. Dawson is available." She heard the other voice say pleasantly, "No need to trouble Jacob. I was hoping to speak with Miss Carter, actually." Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway. His expression was the expression of a man holding back several things at once. "Miss Carter, Brad Collins is at the door asking to speak with you. I can tell him you're busy." Hannah looked at Pete. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and walked through the front room to the door. Brad Collins looked exactly as she remembered him. Fine coat, easy confidence, the comfortable posture of a man who had never had to doubt that doors would open for him. Standing on Jacob Dawson's front step in the March cold, he looked slightly less comfortable than usual, but he covered it quickly with a smile that was designed to be disarming, and that Hannah found to her own satisfaction completely ineffective. "Hannah," he said, "you look well." "Mr. Collins," she said, "what do you want?" He had the grace to look briefly thrown by the directness. "I wanted to apologize," he said. I've been told that some things I said were taken in ways I didn't intend. I want you to know that I never meant to harm your reputation." "Then you should have considered your words more carefully before you said them," Hannah said. He cleared his throat. I want to be honest with you, Hannah. What I did to you at the station was wrong. I know that. I've known it since the moment I said it." He paused, and something shifted in his face. Something that was either genuine or was a very good imitation of it. "Evelyn and I, it didn't work. It turned out we weren't well suited." Hannah looked at him. She understood with absolute clarity what this conversation was. She understood it the way she understood most things practically, without the interference of wishful thinking. "You came here," she said slowly, "to apologize, and to tell me about Evelyn." "Yes," he said. "Why?" He looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard to be earnest. "Because I think I was a fool," he said. "And I think that what I threw away was something worth reconsidering." The air between them was cold and very still. "I see," Hannah said. "Mr. Collins, Brad, I'm going to be direct with you because I was raised to be direct, and because you have already cost me enough time, and I'd rather not waste more of either of ours." She kept her voice level. "What you did at that station was not a mistake of circumstance. It was a choice. You chose to say what you said in a public place in front of witnesses, in a way that was designed to make it final and unavoidable. You called it an inconvenience. She paused. I am not an inconvenience. I am a person. And the version of me you're looking at right now, standing on this step with a job and a kitchen, and a place in this community that I built with my own hands in 6 weeks, is not someone who is available for reconsidering. Brad Collins's expression shifted. Something tighter came into it. You're making a mistake, he said. What you think you have here, what you think Jacob Dawson is offering you, it isn't what it looks like. He hired you because he needed someone disposable, someone who'd work cheap because she had no other options. Do you really think a man like him is going to— I think, said a voice from directly behind Hannah, that you should stop talking. She had not heard Jacob come to the door. She turned slightly, and he was there, not in the doorway he had come outside, was standing behind her and to her left, and his voice was very quiet and very composed, which was somehow more alarming than if he had shouted. Brad Collins's confidence flickered. Jacob, this was a private conversation. On my property, Jacob said, which makes it my conversation too. He stepped forward, coming alongside Hannah, and when he spoke again, there was nothing in his voice except absolute certainty. Miss Carter is employed on this ranch by her own choice and on her own terms. She is respected by every man here and valued far beyond her wage. If you've come to offer her something better, I suggest you be prepared to defend it. And if you've come to say anything else that damages her standing in this county, I suggest you think very carefully about what that will cost you. The two men looked at each other. Collins broke first. He looked away, adjusted his coat, and made the small, self-correcting movements of a man reforming his dignity. I'll leave, he said. That would be best, Jacob said. Brad Collins looked at Hannah one more time. Whatever he saw in her face was apparently not what he'd been hoping for, because he put his hat on and turned and walked back to his horse without another word. Hannah stood on the step until she heard him ride out. Then she turned and went back inside without looking at Jacob, because she needed a moment to get the complicated mixture of things she was feeling back under control before she was ready to discuss any of it. She went back to the stove. She picked up the spoon. She stirred. Jacob came in and stood in the kitchen doorway. Are you all right? He said. Yes, Hannah said. What he said about— I know what he said, Hannah said. It isn't true. I know it isn't, Jacob said. I want you to know I know. She turned from the stove and looked at him. He was still in his coat, and the March cold was still in his face, and he was watching her with those dark, serious eyes that she had stopped trying not to notice. He's going to make more trouble, she said. Probably, Jacob agreed. What happens if he does? Then we handle it, Jacob said, simply, like it was already decided, like we was already the natural word and he hadn't noticed himself using it. Hannah noticed. She turned back to the stove. Dinner's in an hour, she said. Lucas heard about the Collins visit before dinner was on the table. Pete had told Danny Walsh, and Danny Walsh was apparently incapable of keeping information to himself for longer than 20 minutes, and he came into the kitchen at 5 o'clock with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that Hannah had not seen before, the careful, determined look of a 13-year-old boy who has decided to be angry on someone else's behalf and is trying to do it correctly. Miss Carter, he said. Lucas. Collins was here, he said. It was not a question. Yes. And he said things about you. He said some things, Hannah said. Your father handled it. Lucas was quiet for a moment. His jaw was very tight, which on his young face still had that quality of a boy trying on an expression that would fit him better in 10 years. He called you a scheme, Lucas said. I heard that from Pete. Back at the start he was telling people you were running a scheme. Yes, Hannah said. He was. That's not— Lucas stopped. You're not. You cook. You stay up all night when the cattle go through the ice, and you make bread every morning, and you taught Emma how to measure flour right, and you made Roberts's grandmother's bread when you didn't even have to. You just found out what everyone needed, and you made it. His voice was unsteady, in a way he was fighting. That's not a scheme. That's just what good people do. Hannah set the spoon down and turned around. Lucas was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in both hands and his young face tight with something that was not only anger, but was the thing under anger, the thing that gets called anger because it has nowhere easier to go. She recognized it because she had felt it herself on a train platform in January, with $62 in her coat pocket and a man calling her an inconvenience. "Thank you," she said. "He shouldn't have left you on that platform," Lucas said. "Back in January, he shouldn't have done that." "No," Hannah agreed. "He shouldn't have. And if he comes back again, your father will handle it," Hannah said. "And if your father needs help handling it, Pete will handle it. And if Pete needs help, I imagine there are 160 men on this ranch who have eaten food I made and would have something to say about it." She paused. "You don't need to be angry for me, Lucas. I appreciate it. But I've been handling myself for a while now." He looked at her. Then something released in his face, not all the way, not yet, but a portion of it. "I know you have," he said. "I just wanted you to know that I see it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Your father sees it too. You know that." Lucas nodded. He put his hat back on and went out to bring in the horses for the night, and Hannah turned back to the stove and she pressed her hand flat against the warm iron for just a second. Not for any reason she could have explained, just to feel something solid and real and present. The town began to shift in March. Henderson's wife. Her name was Clara. Hannah learned recovered enough to come to the ranch at the end of the first week of March, arriving in her husband's wagon, with a color in her face that hadn't been there before, and a determination to thank Hannah in person. She had brought with her a woman named Martha Greer, the minister's wife, who had apparently been curious about Hannah since the platform incident in January, and had finally found an occasion to introduce herself. Martha Greer was 62 years old, had been in Wyoming for 30 years, and had the particular authority of a woman who had survived everything the territory could throw at her, and come out on the other side, with her sense of humor intact. She sat down at Hannah's kitchen table, looked around with expert eyes and said, "You've done something with this kitchen." "I've cleaned it," Hannah said, "and reorganized the supplies, and replaced the second shelf board which was warped." "Jacob never noticed it was warped," Martha said. "Men rarely notice shelves," Hannah said. "They just notice when things fall off them." Martha laughed a genuine laugh, not a polite one, and from that point their friendship was established without further ceremony. Clara Henderson held her baby on her knee and ate 2 of Emma's biscuits Emma had made them that morning with minimal supervision, and they were nearly perfect, and said with a simplicity that Hannah found more affecting than any elaborate speech would have been, "I ate your bread in the worst week of my life, and it made me feel like someone knew I was there. I just wanted to say that." Emma, who had been listening from the corner with her arms folded and an expression of enormous dignity, said, "Hannah says that's what cooking is for." "She's right," Clara said. "I know," Emma said. "She's right about most things." Hannah made tea and didn't say anything, but the warmth of it stayed with her all afternoon through the bread and the stew and the 6 o'clock dinner and the ledger work afterward, settling into the back of her chest, like something that had been cold for a long time, and was finally carefully warming. The next twist arrived from a direction she should have anticipated, but hadn't. Martha Greer came back 2 days later alone, and sat down at the kitchen table, with the direct look of a woman who intended to say something important, and was going to say it regardless of how it landed. Emma was in the barn with Lucas. Jacob was at the north fence. Hannah set tea between them and waited. "People are talking," Martha said. "They've been talking since January," Hannah said. "Different talk," Martha said. "Not Collins's talk. Different." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "They're talking about Jacob." Hannah kept her face still. "What about him?" "He came into town last Saturday," Martha said. "First time in 2 months. My husband spoke with him for 20 minutes outside the church. He said Jacob seemed different, lighter. He said he laughed at something my husband said, and Hannah Jacob Dawson has not laughed at anything my husband has said in 3 years. My husband is not a funny man, but he used to at least get a smile out of Jacob before Rose died." She looked at Hannah steadily. "He's different since you've been here." "He's eating better," Hannah said. "The whole ranch is eating better. That changes how people feel." Martha looked at her the way wise women look at younger women who are being deliberately obtuse. Hannah. Martha. You know what I'm telling you. I know what you think you're telling me, Hannah said carefully. And I'm not in a position to— Why not? Why? The directness of it silenced her for a moment. She looked at her tea. Because I work for him, she said. Because I came here as a rejected mail-order bride, and half the county already thinks I'm running some kind of scheme to attach myself to a wealthy man. Because acting on anything, feeling anything beyond what my job requires would prove every single thing Brad Collins has said about me. Martha Greer was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Sweetheart, the people who believe Collins already believe him. And the people who don't believe him already don't. Nothing you do or don't do is going to change that math. His children, Hannah said. His children adore you. That's exactly the problem, Hannah said. If I allow something that turns out to be if it doesn't, Emma has already lost one woman in this house. I won't be another loss for her. I won't. The silence after that was a different quality of silence. Martha looked at her with an expression that was not pity and was not admiration, but was something between them. The look of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize another woman's real reason when she hears it. You're protecting the children, Martha said. I'm doing my job, Hannah said. Which is cooking. Martha nodded slowly. She drank her tea. She said, Collins is going to do something bigger. I want you to be prepared for that. He's been quiet for 2 weeks, which for Brad Collins means he's been thinking. And when Brad Collins thinks for 2 weeks, it usually means someone else gets the trouble. Hannah looked up. What have you heard? Nothing specific, Martha said. Just the shape of it. He was at the county land office on Monday, and he was talking to Judge Harmon on Wednesday. She paused. Jacob should know. I'll tell him, Hannah said. She told him that evening, the same efficient delivery she used for anything important. Straight, no preamble, just the facts as Martha had given them. Jacob listened without interrupting his face, going very still in the particular way it did when he was processing something he didn't like. The land office, he said. That's what Martha said. And Harmon. He was quiet. Harmon owes Collins a favor. Something from last year, a water rights dispute that went Collins's way when it probably shouldn't have. What could he do? Hannah said. Through the land office. There was a question 3 years ago, Jacob said slowly, about the boundary on the north pasture. A survey dispute. We resolved it. I thought we resolved it, but if Collins has found a way to reopen it through Harmon— He stopped. It would tie up that whole section of grazing land through the spring season. The cattle need that pasture. Without it, we're looking at— He pressed his hand flat on the table. It could cost us a bad season. Hannah was quiet. Then she said, Can you get ahead of it? Talk to Harmon yourself before Collins does anything official. I can try. He looked at her. Why would Collins do this now? He's got his own ranch, his own land. This serves nothing except— It serves hurting you, Hannah said. Because you defended me. The look that crossed Jacob's face then was something she had not seen before. A cold, clear anger. Not the hot kind that makes people careless, but the settled kind that makes them determined. He's going after my ranch, Jacob said, because he wants to get at you. Yes, Hannah said. That's not acceptable, Jacob said. No, Hannah agreed. It isn't. He stood up from the table. He said, I'll ride to town tomorrow and see Harmon first thing in the morning. Pete will come with me. He paused. I need you to stay here. I need the house to be. I need everything to be normal for the children. It will be, Hannah said. I'll make cinnamon rolls in the morning. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Emma will hold you to that. I know, Hannah said. Go see Harmon. Fix the land problem. I'll keep the house. He looked at her, one of those long, dark-eyed looks that Emma had accurately described as trying to figure something out, and then he said very quietly, Thank you, Hannah. It was the first time he had used her given name. She heard it land in the room and felt it settle somewhere in her chest and did not address it. Good night, Mr. Dawson, she said with complete composure. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, Jacob. She met his eyes. "Good night, Jacob." He went upstairs. Hannah sat at the kitchen table for a long time, after that not moving, just sitting in the warm quiet of the kitchen she had claimed and built and made into something worth being inside. The stove settled. The bread from the morning still faintly perfumed the air. Outside, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming did, pressing against everything vast and indifferent and enormous, not cruel, just large. She thought about Emma's face when she learned to make a biscuit that didn't come out like a rock. She thought about Lucas at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning, with his hands wrapped around a bowl of soup after a night in the cold. She thought about Roberts with his eyes wet over molasses bread. She thought about Clara Henderson saying someone knew I was there. She thought about Jacob's voice, saying her name. She thought about what she had told Emma, that love didn't stop when someone was gone, that it got quieter, and that there was always room for new things beside it. She thought about what Martha had said. The people who believe Collins already believe him. She thought about $62 and a one-way ticket and a worn suitcase and a man who called her an inconvenience, and she thought about how far she was from that platform. Not in miles. The miles were the same, but in every other measurement. She was not the woman who had sat on that bench wondering now what. She was still figuring out who she was instead. She got up, covered the bread for tomorrow morning, banked the stove, turned down the lamp. She went upstairs. Tomorrow there would be cinnamon rolls, and Jacob would ride to town, and Collins was going to make his move through the land office, and there was going to be a fight she couldn't entirely predict the shape of. But tonight the house was warm, and the children were asleep, and she had called a man by his given name for the first time, and he had given it to her like it was something worth having. She could afford to let that be enough for one night. Jacob came back from town on Thursday with Pete, and a look on his face that Hannah had not seen before. Not the cold anger from the night before, but something more complicated, something that sat between anger and calculation, and a third thing she couldn't name yet. She had the cinnamon rolls on the table, and Emma beside her when they came through the door, and Emma launched herself at her father, the way she always did when he'd been gone more than a day, and Jacob caught her and held her for a moment, with his face pressed into her hair, before setting her down and looking across the room at Hannah. "Collins filed the dispute," he said. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron. "When?" "Tuesday, the same day Martha heard he was at the land office." He pulled off his coat and sat down at the table. Pete came in behind him and stood near the door with his hat in his hands, and the careful stillness of a man who has news he doesn't want to deliver. "He found a surveyor's notation from 1871 before my father built the main fence line that puts the north boundary 400 yards south of where we've been running it." "Is the notation legitimate?" Hannah said. "It's legitimate," Jacob said. "The survey is real. But what it doesn't show is the agreement my father made with the previous owner in 1873 that moved the boundary north in exchange for water access rights on the creek. That agreement was verbal. My father's word against a dead man's land records. There's no written record of it." "There might be," Pete said from the door. "Your father kept records, Jacob, everything, but they're in those crates in the storage barn. Nobody's touched them since he died." Jacob looked at Pete. Then he looked at Hannah. Something moved between them, a question and an answer, both without words. "How long do we have?" Hannah said. "Harmon gave a 60-day window for counter-documentation," Jacob said. "After that, the notation stands, and Collins gets a formal survey of the new line. Then you go through the crates," Hannah said. "Pete knows the storage barn. Lucas is good with records, you told me yourself. He handled the east fence accounting better than the men, twice his age. Put Lucas on the crates with Pete and you focus on keeping the ranch running." She paused. "What does the north pasture mean in real terms if you lose it?" Jacob's jaw tightened. 400 head can't graze through the summer. We'd have to move them to the western section, which is already at capacity, or sell down the herd. Selling down means taking a loss on cattle we plan to carry through to fall market. He pressed his knuckles against the table. "Collins knows exactly what he's doing. He doesn't want the land. He wants to cost me a season." "Because of me," Hannah said. "Don't," Jacob said immediately, and his voice was sharp, not at her, but at the idea at the shape of it. Don't put that on yourself. Collins is doing this because he's the kind of man who can't stand losing without making someone else pay for it. You didn't cause that. That's who he is. Emma, who had been very quiet at the table eating a cinnamon roll with the focused attention of a child pretending very hard not to be listening, said, "Can Lucas really find the paper?" "If it exists," Pete said. "And if your grandfather kept it, then Lucas will find it." "He will," Emma said with absolute certainty. "He finds everything. Last fall he found Papa's good hunting knife in the feed barn under a loose board. Nobody even knew it was missing." Pete made a sound that was almost a laugh despite himself. Jacob looked at his daughter with an expression that held a complicated mix of tenderness and something that was trying very hard not to be fear. He looked back at Hannah. "Go look at the crates," Hannah said quietly. "I'll keep things running here." He nodded once and went. She kept things running. That was the week she understood what the ranch actually required of her. Not just the cooking, which she had long since systematized into a rhythm that could withstand most disruptions, but the holding, the keeping of the center, the particular invisible work of making sure that while the men were worried about land records and boundary disputes, and Collins's maneuvering, they came in for meals, and the meals were good, and the kitchen was warm, and there was one place in the day that felt like it was not under siege. She made corn chowder on Monday, because it was the kind of meal that filled the body completely and left no room for anxiety to rattle around in. She made pot roast on Tuesday, because the smell of it braising all day was a specific kind of reassurance patient and generous, the smell of a kitchen that was not panicking. She sent the food wagon out to the north fence crew with extra bread and a jar of pickled vegetables, because those men were working in the cold and were far enough from the house to feel isolated, and isolation made worry worse. She also quietly, and without making anything of it, started listening more carefully than usual to every conversation that passed through the kitchen. She heard from Danny Walsh that Collins had been seen having dinner with two of the county commissioners at the hotel in town. She heard from Briggs that a lawyer from Cheyenne had arrived and was staying at the hotel, and that Collins had been seen meeting with him twice. She heard from old Roberts, who had a friend who worked at the land office, that the 60-day window Harmon had quoted was technically correct, but that there was a provision for expedited resolution if both parties agreed, and that Collins was apparently planning to request that provision, cutting the window to 30 days. She told Jacob that evening, standing in the kitchen doorway, while he ate, because he had not sat down for a proper meal in 3 days. "Sit down," she said first. He looked at her. "Sit down and eat something real," she said. "You can't think straight on nothing. Sit." He sat. She put food in front of him, and then told him what Roberts had said about the 30-day provision. Jacob's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down. "He's cutting the time in half. If he makes the request," Hannah said. "Roberts said he hadn't filed it yet as of this morning." "Then I need to be in that office before he does," Jacob said. He was already pushing back from the table. "Finish eating first," Hannah said. "Hannah, you have 12 minutes before the 30-day provision becomes the most important thing in the world," Hannah said. "Eat for 10 of them." He looked at her for a moment with that look, the one she had stopped pretending she didn't notice, and then he picked up his fork and ate. She stood at the stove and didn't watch him, but she was aware of him, the way she was always aware of him now, with a peripheral attention that she had given up arguing was purely professional. "Pete and Lucas have been through 4 crates," he said between bites. "Nothing yet, but there are 12 more." "Lucas will find it," Hannah said. "You sound like Emma." "Emma is 9, and she knows her brother," Hannah said. "Sometimes that's enough authority." He almost smiled. He finished eating. He went back to the storage barn, and Hannah washed the dish and made bread for the morning, and did not let herself think about 30 days, or land office provisions, or Brad Collins having dinner with county commissioners. She thought about the bread. The bread was what she could do. Lucas found the document on Saturday morning. He came running into the kitchen at 6:45, actually running, which Hannah had never seen him do. He was a boy who moved with deliberate adult composure, and he slid to a stop on the kitchen floor and held up a folded piece of paper that was brown at the edges and soft at the folds, and said, breathing hard, "I found it. It's here, the boundary agreement." 1873. My grandfather's signature witnessed by two men. One of them is Judge Harmon's own father. Hannah set the biscuit pan down. Emma at the table stood up so fast her stool scraped. Lucas spread the document on the kitchen table with hands that were shaking slightly, not from fear, from the particular physical aftermath of sustained hope, finally paying off, and Hannah looked at it. She couldn't read the legal language fully, but she could see the signatures, the date, the official seal, and she could see that Lucas understood exactly what he was looking at, because his face was a 13-year-old's version of triumph, which was beautiful and unguarded in a way his face rarely was anymore. "Get your father," Hannah said. "He's at the storage barn," Lucas said. "I came here first." "Why here first?" Lucas looked at her, his young face still flushed from running. Held something she recognized, the same thing she'd felt when she'd handed Henderson's wife that bundle of bread, the particular urgency of wanting to share good news with the right person first. "I don't know," he said, which was honest. "Go get your father," Hannah said. "Now. Run." He ran. Jacob was at the kitchen table 12 minutes later with Pete on one side and Lucas on the other, and the document between them, and he read it once, and then again, and then he put both hands flat on the table and stayed very still for a moment. Then he looked at his son. "You found this," he said. "Crate 11, Lucas said. Back left corner underneath the property tax records for 1875 and 1876. Jacob looked at his son for a long time. Something was moving through his face that was too large and too specific to describe, except to say that it was a father seeing his child as a person fully, for the first time in a long time, not as the boy he was trying to protect from grief, but as the person that boy had become in the space between loss and now. "That's good work, son," Jacob said. Lucas's chin moved slightly. He swallowed. "Yes, sir," he said with the compressed steadiness of a boy holding something large very tightly. Pete cleared his throat and said, "I'll get the wagon ready. We should be at Harmon's office when it opens Monday morning." "I'll go today," Jacob said. "He lives 3 miles east. I'll ride out." "Today's Saturday," Pete said. "I know what day it is," Jacob said. He stood up already reaching for his coat. He looked at Hannah. "Will you be all right here until this evening?" "We've been all right every other day you've ridden out," Hannah said. "I know," he said. He stopped. He looked at her with a directness that was unusual even for him and said more quietly, "I'll be back before dark." "I know you will," she said. He went. Emma immediately sat down next to Lucas and said with enormous seriousness, "You saved the ranch." "I found a piece of paper," Lucas said. "That's the same thing," Emma said. Lucas looked at his sister. Then the composure cracked just slightly, and he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same neighborhood, and Emma leaned against his arm, and Hannah turned back to the stove, because that moment belonged to the two of them. Jacob rode back in at 4 in the afternoon earlier than she'd expected. She heard the horse in the yard, and then his boots on the front steps, and she came to the kitchen doorway and looked at his face when he came through the door. "Harmon accepted the document," he said. "The dispute is closed. Collins gets nothing." The breath that came out of Hannah then was not something she had planned. She had been holding it for 4 days without knowing, and when it came out, she had to turn away from Jacob for a moment and look at the stove, because the relief was larger than she was prepared to show anyone. "Good," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "Hannah," Jacob said. "I need to check the bread," she said. "Hannah." His voice was different, lower, more deliberate, and she heard him cross the kitchen, and she heard him stop a few feet behind her. "Thank you." "I didn't do anything," she said. "Lucas found the document. You rode to Harmon. You made me sit down and eat on Wednesday night," Jacob said. "You told me about the 30-day provision before Collins could file it. You kept this house running for 4 days, while I was half out of my mind with worry, and you kept the children settled and the men fed, and you didn't let any of it come apart." He paused. "That's not nothing, not." She turned around. He was closer than she'd realized, and the afternoon light from the south window was in his face, and he was looking at her with the look that Emma had described, and Martha had commented on, and that Hannah had been carefully not interpreting for 2 months. She looked back. steadily. Because she had decided somewhere in the 4 days of bread and soup and ledgers and Collins and 30-day provisions that she was done pretending she didn't see what she saw. "You're welcome," she said. They stood there for a moment in the kitchen that smelled of bread and cinnamon and coffee, with the stove ticking and the wind pressing against the windows, and neither of them said anything else. Then Emma appeared at the kitchen door and said, "Is it over? Did we win?" And Jacob stepped back and turned to his daughter and said, "It's over. We won." And Emma made a sound of pure satisfaction and went to tell Lucas, and the moment closed. But it had existed. That was enough. The storm arrived on a Monday night in late March, and it did not announce itself politely. Hannah woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the wind-changing register going from the ordinary Wyoming press to something more violent, more purposeful, with an ice in it that she could feel through the walls. She was at the kitchen window in 90 seconds. She couldn't see past 20 feet. The temperature had dropped hard and fast, and the snow that was coming down was not the soft kind, but the cutting kind, horizontal and relentless. She had the stove going before she'd fully decided to get up. Jacob was downstairs 10 minutes later, already dressed, because Jacob Dawson slept lightly, and his ranch's weather was one of the things that woke him. He took one look at Hannah at the stove and said, "The North Herd." "How many men do you need?" she said. "All of them," he said. He was already at the door. "Pete's in the bunkhouse," she said. "I'll send food with whoever goes." "How long?" "Could be through dawn," he said. "Could be longer." "I'll cook through it," she said. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he was out the door. She cooked through it. The storm was the worst of the season, not the worst in Wyoming's history, but bad enough. It lasted 36 hours, and during those 36 hours, Hannah did not sleep. She made soup in batches, rotating pots on the stove, so there was always something hot. She made biscuits every 2 hours because they could be carried in coat pockets and eaten without stopping. She made coffee in quantities that should have been impossible and kept it hot on the back burner. She sent Emma upstairs when the storm got bad enough that the cold was coming through the window gaps, and she sat Emma at the kitchen table with tasks. When the child refused to go first, measuring, then wrapping biscuits in cloth, then keeping the coffee stirred so it wouldn't burn, small necessary tasks that gave Emma something to do with her worry. Lucas came in at intervals bringing reports from the field and taking food back out with him. He was doing a man's work in that storm, and he knew it, and Hannah could see him knowing it, the particular straightening of a boy becoming someone, and every time he came in, she had something hot and ready before he reached the table. At hour 14, when Hannah was on her 4th pot of soup and her 8th batch of biscuits, and her hands were cramped from the work, Pete Gallagher came in from the cold with ice in his beard and sat down at the kitchen table and looked at the food she set in front of him, and then at her with an expression that was beyond gratitude, was something more like reverence, and said, "Miss Carter, how are you still standing?" "Same way you are," she said. "1 hour at a time." Pete ate, he said without looking up from his bowl. "Jacob's going to lose 6 head if this holds through tomorrow. Maybe more." "The north pasture fence went down in the first hour, and by the time we got there..." He stopped. "It's bad. I don't want to tell you how bad." "Tell me anyway," Hannah said. "I need to know what we're managing," Pete told her. 6 cattle already down, possibly 12 by morning. The north fence would need 3 weeks of work before it was sound again. 2 men had mild frostbite on their hands and needed to be kept warm and watched. The hay stores in the north barn were frozen, which meant the surviving cattle couldn't eat without the men breaking the bales by hand in the cold. Hannah absorbed all of it. She cataloged it the way she cataloged everything, practically without panic, asking what was actionable and what wasn't. The men with frostbite needed warm food and dry clothes and rest. She could do that. The cattle she couldn't help with, but she could keep every man standing who might be able to. The hay she couldn't fix, but she could make sure the men breaking frozen bales at 3 in the morning had full stomachs before they went back out. "Send me the 2 men with the frostbite," she said. "Right now. And tell the hay crew I'll have hot food ready in 40 minutes. Pete looked at her. "You've got soup on and biscuits, and you've been awake for 40 minutes, Hannah said. He went. The two men with frostbite Jenkins and a young hand named Cullum, who couldn't have been more than 19, came in half an hour later, and Hannah sat them at the table and examined their hands with the practical knowledge of a woman who had grown up in Ohio winters and knew the difference between frostnip and actual frostbite, and theirs was bad, but not the worst kind, and she told them so, and wrapped their hands in warm cloths soaked in water that was hot but not scalding, and she sat Cullum, who was shaking badly and trying to hide it close to the stove, and talked to him while she worked about nothing in particular, just steady human voice to hold him to the present moment while his body remembered it was warm. "First bad storm?" she asked him. "Yes, ma'am," Cullum said. His voice was shaking as much as his hands. "You did the right things," she said. "You came in when Pete told you. That's the main thing." "I didn't want to come in," he said. "Jacob was still out there." "Jacob's been through 30 of these," Hannah said. "He knows exactly how bad it can get. You don't yet. You come in when you're told until you know." Cullum nodded. Some of the shaking eased. Not all of it, but some. Jenkins across the table said without preamble, "How long have you been awake?" "Long enough," Hannah said. "You should sleep," Jenkins said. "When the storm breaks," she said. Jenkins looked at his wrapped hands and then at the soup in front of him, and then at Hannah, and said with the gruffness that was his characteristic form of sincerity, "You're good people, Miss Carter, whatever that Collins fool says." "Thank you, Jenkins," she said. "I mean it," he said. "Good people. I know you mean it," she said. "Eat your soup." Jacob came in at hour 22. She heard his boots on the front step and the particular sound of a man moving carefully because he was exhausted and had been moving through severe cold for nearly a day, and she had a mug of black coffee ready before he reached the kitchen. He came through the door and stopped. He looked like the storm. He had ice on his coat, and his face was raw from the wind, and there was an exhaustion in him that went past the body, the bone-deep kind, the kind that comes from fighting something that doesn't care how hard you fight it. She handed him the coffee. He took it with both hands. "How many?" she said. "8, he said. "We saved the rest." "8 is not 12, she said. "Pete thought 12. "Pete was right to think it," Jacob said. He sat down at the table, and she set food in front of him, and he ate slowly, mechanically, the way men eat when they're too tired to taste anything but know they have to eat. "The fence is down in 3 sections. We can't repair it until the storm breaks and the ground thaws." "What does that mean for the herd?" "It means we run a watch rotation on the north boundary until it's repaired, day and night, 3 men at a time." He looked up. "Hannah, the supply stores. We're going to need more than I planned for. The storm's going to hold for at least another day, and the men can't work on empty. I inventoried this morning," she said. "At 6 a.m. before the second wave hit. We have enough flour for 4 more days of bread at current rate. Enough beans for 5 days of soup. The salt pork is getting low, 2 days, maybe 3. Coffee is fine. I can stretch everything if I need to make it last longer. But you need to get a supply wagon out as soon as the roads are passable." I was looking at her with an expression she was starting to understand, startled every time by what she had already done before he thought to ask. "You inventoried at 6 a.m., he said. "I knew it was going to be a long storm," she said. "Planning is what you do before you need the plan." He set his coffee mug down and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he had been doing with increasing frequency and intensity since the night they'd sat at the kitchen table together and he'd said her name for the first time. There was something in his face that was not just tiredness and not just gratitude, something that was building toward a shape she recognized but was not yet ready to call by its name. "What would I have done," he said, "if Pete hadn't gone to that platform in January?" "Pete didn't go to the platform," Hannah said. "You did." "I did," he agreed. He looked at his food. "I almost didn't. He stopped. "I almost let you sit there. I told Pete when I saw what happened that it wasn't our business. And Pete said, then it's going to bother you for a long time. And He made a sound. "I walked over because I couldn't not. Because there was something about the way you sat there that was..." He stopped again. "What?" Hannah said. "Like you were deciding what to do next instead of falling apart," he said. "Like whatever he'd done to you, You were already past it and on to the practical question. He looked up. I'd never seen anyone sit like that. Not in grief. Not in that kind of public humiliation. Like nothing he did could reach the thing in you that was actually important. Hannah held very still. I wanted to know what that was, Jacob said. That's why I walked over. The storm pressed against the house. The stove ticked. Somewhere upstairs, Emma was asleep, and Lucas was asleep, and the ranch outside was in the middle of the worst night of the season. It's just stubbornness, Hannah said finally. No, Jacob said. It isn't. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything else because they were both tired, and the storm was still going, and there were things building between them that neither of them was ready to open yet. Things that needed the right moment and the right ground, and not the 22nd hour of a Wyoming blizzard with ice still in his coat. Sleep, she said. I'll keep the stove going. You haven't slept in... Jacob, she said. He stopped. Sleep, she said. I've got it. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, and he did something he hadn't done before. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed. Just one hand, just for a second. Not a gesture of anything except what it was. A man who has run out of words using his hand to say the thing instead. Then he went upstairs. Hannah stood at the stove and put her hand over the place. His hand had been, and felt the warmth of it, and did not make anything of it, and did not dismiss it either. She just held it there for a moment in the warm kitchen in the middle of the storm. Then she went back to the soup. The storm broke on Wednesday morning, and the sun came out over a Wyoming landscape that was white and changed and enormous, and the ranch came back to life the way things do after a bad time, slowly with effort, with the particular tenderness of people who have been through something together and know it. Collins struck on Thursday. Not the land dispute. This time Jacob had closed that. Not rumors, not whispers. Collins came to the county commissioners' meeting in Milford on Thursday afternoon, and he brought the Cheyenne lawyer, and he stood up in front of Commissioner Alderman and Commissioner Webb and the dozen townspeople present, and made a formal statement that Jacob Dawson was harboring an immoral arrangement at his ranch, that he had installed a single woman in his household under the guise of employment, that this arrangement was improper and damaging to the community's standards, and that Miss Hannah Carter's presence on the Dawson Ranch was unsuitable and should be formally addressed. Hannah heard about it from Martha Greer, who appeared at the ranch door at 4:30 Thursday afternoon with a look on her face that combined fury and urgency in roughly equal measure. He made it official, Martha said, coming in and sitting down before Hannah could say a word. He went in front of the commissioners. He used words like immoral. He brought a lawyer. Hannah felt something go cold in her chest. Not fear exactly. Something more like the recognition of a thing she had known was coming and had hoped would wait longer. What can the commissioners do? She said. Technically nothing, Martha said. There's no ordinance against a woman working as a cook on a private ranch. But Collins isn't going for ordinance, he's going for reputation. He wants your name in an official record. He wants Jacob's name beside yours in an official record. He wants the story fixed. She looked at Hannah with the directness she always brought to hard conversations. He knows he can't touch the land anymore. He can't touch the business, so he's going after the one thing he thinks Jacob is vulnerable about. Me, Hannah said. You, Martha said. And Jacob's feelings, which at this point are obvious to everyone in this county, except apparently you and Jacob. Hannah sat down across from Martha. The kitchen was quiet. Emma was at the barn with Lucas. Jacob was at the north fence repair. She had maybe an hour. What do people think? She said. The people who were there, what did they say? Martha was quiet for a moment. Collins spoke for 10 minutes, she said. He was very smooth about it, very careful with the language. The lawyer spoke for 5 minutes. And then Alderman said that before any formal note was entered in the record, he wanted to hear from the people in the room who actually knew Miss Carter. Martha paused. Hannah. 12 people spoke. 12, Hannah said. Henderson spoke, Martha said. He told them about his wife, about the bread, about what you said to him at the door. Her voice had gotten quieter. Robert spoke. He said you'd made his grandmother's bread without being asked, and that he hadn't felt at home anywhere in 30 years until that Thursday morning. Jenkins spoke. He said, She stopped. What did Jenkins say? Hannah said. He said you wrapped his hands in warm cloths during the storm and talked him through the cold, and that if that was immorality, then the word had lost its meaning. Martha's eyes were bright. Colum spoke. He's 19, Hannah. He stood up in front of 2 county commissioners and a Cheyenne lawyer and said that you sat with him when he was shaking and told him he'd done the right things. Briggs spoke about his wife. Clara Henderson was there, and she spoke about her baby. Danny Walsh stood up, and he could barely get the words out, but he said you'd made him feel like his sister wasn't entirely gone. She stopped. 12 people. Collins's lawyer tried to object, and Alderman told him to sit down. Hannah's hands were flat on the table. She was not entirely sure what was happening in her chest. What did the commissioners decide? She said. Her voice was almost steady. Alderman said, and I'm quoting this exactly because I wrote it down the moment I got outside. He said, Mr. Collins, I'm not going to enter anything in this record that speaks against a woman who spent 36 hours in a blizzard feeding everyone on that ranch so they could stay alive. I suggest you find a different project. And Webb seconded it. Martha reached across the table and put her hand over Hannah's. Collins left. His lawyer left. The 12 people who'd spoken went home. Hannah looked at Martha's hand on hers. She thought about Roberts at the breakfast table with his eyes wet. She thought about Colum shaking at the stove. She thought about Danny Walsh barely getting his words out in front of a commissioner because he was talking about a dead girl who liked the name Grace. She thought about 12 people standing up in a public room when they didn't have to. She had not come 3,000 miles for this. She had come 3,000 miles for something entirely different, and it had collapsed on a train platform, and she had sat on a bench and thought, now what? And now here she was with Martha Greer's hand on hers, and 12 people's voices in an official room and a kitchen she'd built from low stores and good bones, and a family who had let her in through the only door she'd ever had. The kitchen door, the practical door, the one that didn't require anything except showing up and doing the work. She pressed her eyes shut for 1 second. Then she opened them and said, I need to tell Jacob before he hears it from someone else. Yes, Martha said. You do. Will you stay until he comes in? I'll make the tea, Martha said, and stood up. Jacob came in from the north fence at 5:30 with mud on his boots and the particular satisfaction of a man who has been doing physical work that needed to be done, and he stopped when he saw Martha at the stove and Hannah at the table with her hands folded and both women looking at him. What happened? He said. Hannah told him. She told it plainly, the way she told him everything the commissioners' meeting Collins's formal statement, the lawyer, the 12 people, Alderman's ruling. She watched his face move through the telling. She watched the anger come in, and then something underneath the anger that was harder to read and more important. When she finished, Jacob was very still. 12 people, he said. Yes. Roberts spoke, he said. Yes. Jenkins, he said. Yes. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment. He looked at Martha, who met his look with her particular expression of a woman who has already decided what needs to happen and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. Then he looked at Hannah. I should have been there, he said. There was nothing for you to do there, Hannah said. It was handled. Not by me, he said. And there was something raw in his voice, not anger at her, something directed at himself, at the fact that 12 of his men and neighbors had stood up for his cook in a public room while he was mending a fence 3 miles away. Jacob, Hannah said. He looked at her. They didn't stand up for your cook, she said quietly. They stood up for themselves, for what they felt in that kitchen. That's different. She paused. That's the whole point. He held her gaze. The rawness in his face did not go away, but something settled underneath it, a recognition maybe, or the beginning of one. Martha poured 3 cups of tea and set them on the table with the brisk authority of a woman who has decided that the emotional portion of the evening has gone on long enough and everyone needs to sit down. Sit, she said to both of them. They sat. And in the kitchen, that smelled of bread and storm and work and everything. Hannah Carter had built from almost nothing. In 3 months, the three of them drank their tea while outside the Wyoming sun went down gold and slow over a landscape that was vast and indifferent and enormous. But inside was warm, and that Hannah had learned was the thing that actually mattered. Not the land or the weather or Brad Collins's maneuvering or the county commissioner's records. Not even the 12 voices in a public room, though those mattered more than she could say. What mattered was the inside, the warmth, the table, the people around it. She had known that before she came here. Her mother had taught her that in the kitchen back in Ohio, over a wood stove, not entirely different from this one. She just hadn't known until now that she could build it somewhere new. Martha left at 7, and this kitchen went quiet, in the way it did after a storm. Not empty, just settled like a room that had absorbed something large and was adjusting to the new weight of it. Jacob sat at the table after she left. He didn't go back to the fence accounts. He didn't pick up the ledger. He just sat with his tea going cold in front of him, and the look on his face of a man who has been circling something for a long time and has finally run out of room to keep circling. Hannah washed the cups. She started the bread for tomorrow. She did the things she always did at this hour because the doing of them was what she knew, and what she knew was what kept everything from becoming too large to stand inside. 12 people, Jacob said again. You keep saying that, Hannah said. Because I keep thinking about it. He looked at his hands on the table. Roberts, Jenkins, Collum. He's 19 years old, Hannah. He stood up in front of commissioners. He's a good young man, Hannah said. He stood up because of you. He stood up because of what he felt in this kitchen. Hannah said the same thing she'd said before, patient and precise. There's a difference. Jacob looked up at her. Why do you keep making that distinction? She turned from the stove and looked at him directly. Because the distinction matters. I didn't give those men anything. I cooked for them. I paid attention to them. I showed up. What they gave back, that was theirs, their choice. I can't take credit for another person's courage. Jacob looked at her for a long time. Can I ask you something? You can ask me anything, she said. You generally do. When you were sitting on that bench in January, he said slowly, after Collins walked away, what were you actually thinking? She considered the question. She had not thought about that bench in weeks, had deliberately not thought about it the way you don't poke at a bruise once it's started to heal. But Jacob's face was serious and open in a way she'd learned to meet honestly. I was thinking about money, she said. How much I had, how long it would last, whether there was seamstress work in Milford or a teaching position somewhere in the county. She paused. And I was thinking about my mother, what she'd say if she could see me. She turned back to the bread dough. She'd have said something practical, and it would have made me feel better. She had a talent for that. What would she have said? Hannah pressed the dough and folded it and thought about it honestly. She'd have said, well, now you know who he is. That's worth knowing. Jacob made a sound close to a laugh but softer. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She is, Hannah said. She'd like this kitchen. She'd be welcome in it, Jacob said, and the simplicity of it landed between them like something that had been waiting to be said. Hannah kept her hands in the dough. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask me anything, he said. An echo deliberate. She heard it. Rose, she said. She felt the air in the room shift slightly when she said the name, the way it always did. Not tension, but attention, the particular quality of a space around a loss. Do you talk about her to anyone? I was quiet for a moment. Not enough, he said. Pete sometimes. Not to the children I didn't want to. I thought I was protecting them. And then you told me Lucas was protecting me in the same way, and I understood that I'd gotten it entirely wrong. Not wrong, Hannah said. Just incomplete. Is that a distinction you're making on my behalf? Yes, she said simply. Because it's the accurate one. He exhaled. She would have liked you, he said. Rose. She had no patience for indirection or pretense. She said exactly what she meant, and she expected the same back, and she didn't apologize for either. He paused. The first time I met her, I said something diplomatic about her father's fence line. It was a disaster, anyone could see it, and she looked at me and said, "You can either say what you think or leave Mr. Dawson, but you cannot do both." He stopped. I told her the fence was a disaster. We were married 8 months later. Hannah smiled. She couldn't help it. "She sounds like she was extraordinary." "She was," Jacob said. "She was the kind of person who made everything around her more real, more itself." He was quiet for a moment. "When she died, I thought the house would never feel like a house again. I thought I'd just run the ranch until I couldn't anymore, and that would be the shape of things." His voice was steady, but underneath it was the particular texture of a grief that has been carried so long it has become part of the body's architecture. "And then you came." Hannah was very still. "I'm not saying it the way it sounds," Jacob said quickly. "I'm not. I know what you are here, what you've been. I'm not trying to—" "Jacob," Hannah said. He stopped. She turned around and looked at him. She had been working up to something for 4 months, without knowing she was working up to it, the way bread rises slowly in the right conditions, until it's ready, and you can't argue with it anymore. "Say what you actually mean," she said. "You told me once that you don't have a gift for making things sound better than they are. I've always appreciated that. So say what you mean." He held her gaze. His hands were flat on the table, and his face was open in a way she hadn't seen it be open before, not unguarded exactly, but deliberate, like a man who has decided the guarding costs more than it protects. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not because this ranch needs a cook, because I—" He stopped. He tried again. "Because this house became itself again when you walked into it. And I don't mean the meals, though. God knows the meals. I mean Emma at the table laughing at something you said. Lucas talking about the horses with someone who actually listens. Robert's every Thursday morning. The kitchen light at 4 a.m. when I come downstairs and you're already—" He stopped a third time. "I mean all of it. I mean you." The bread dough sat on the table between them, forgotten. Hannah looked at Jacob Dawson, the man who had crossed a train platform in January, because he couldn't not, who had called her an inconvenience to no one, and called Collins one to his face, who had put his hand briefly on her shoulder at hour 22 of a blizzard, and said more with that gesture than most men said in a year. She thought about what she had told Emma. That love didn't stop when someone was gone. That it got quieter. That there was always room beside it, not instead of it. She thought about what she'd told Martha. That she wouldn't be another loss for Emma. That she was protecting the children. She thought about the real reason she'd been careful, which was not just the children, and not just the rumors, and not just propriety, but something older and more private. The particular caution of a woman who had sold her grandmother's brooch for a one-way ticket, and arrived at a destination that didn't want her, and who had learned in the sharpest possible way what it cost to commit to something completely before you knew if the ground would hold. She needed to know the ground would hold. "I need to ask you something first," she said, "before I say anything back." "Ask?" he said. "If I say yes to whatever you're asking, and I understand what you're asking, it has to be real. Not gratitude, not convenience, not the ranch needing a cook." She looked at him steadily. "I came 3,000 miles on the basis of letters from a man who needed someone useful, and I ended up on a bench in January with nothing. I will not do that again. Not for any version of the same thing with a different name on it." Jacob looked at her. His face was still open. He didn't flinch from what she'd said. "It's not gratitude," he said. "I know what gratitude feels like. I'm grateful to Pete every day, and I've never once thought about whether Pete was in the house when I got home from the north fence." He paused. "It's not convenience. I was inconvenienced before you came. That's actually what it was. The kitchen was an inconvenience, a problem to solve. What I feel now is nothing like inconvenience." He said the word the way she knew he meant it, as a counter to Collins, as a deliberate reclamation of it. "And as for the ranch needing a cook, the ranch can hire another cook. The ranch cannot hire another you. There is no other you. I've looked for 3 years. Not for you specifically. I didn't know to look for you. But for the thing you are, the quality of you. And I had begun to think it didn't exist in the world. And then you sat down on that bench." The kitchen was very quiet. Hannah pressed her hands flat on the table beside the bread dough and looked at them for a moment. Then she looked up. "All right," she said. Jacob was very still. "All right." "Yes," she said. "I mean yes." Something moved through his face, then relief and warmth, and something that was almost disbelief, the look of a man who prepared thoroughly for disappointment and has just been handed something he didn't plan for. He stood up from the table. He crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her, and he was close enough that she could see the March cold still in the weathering of his face, and the particular dark of his eyes, and the way he was looking at her, like she was something real that he was only now fully allowing himself to see. He said, "I don't have a ring. I don't need a ring right now," Hannah said. "I'll get one." "I know you will," she said. "You're a man who follows through." He put his hands on either side of her face, the way you hold something you've been afraid to drop, and he looked at her for one more moment, and then he kissed her, and it was not a complicated kiss. It was the kind that happens when two people have been waiting long enough that when it finally arrives, there is nothing tentative or cautious about it. Just the honest, complete arrival of a thing that has been true for a while and is finally permitted to be true out loud. When they stepped apart, Hannah was aware that the bread dough needed attention and the stove needed banking, and there were 12 hours of tomorrow that were going to require the same things from her that every other day had required, and that none of that had changed, and that she was glad none of it had changed. "The children," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Let me tell them tomorrow. Let tonight be." He stopped. "Tonight," she agreed. I went upstairs. She banked the stove and covered the bread and turned down the lamp, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment in the quiet and felt the house around her. Emma asleep upstairs. Lucas asleep. The ranch outside in the dark. The Wyoming cold pressing against the windows, and finding as it always did the warm center of the house to push against. She pressed her hand flat against the stove, warm, solid, real. Then she went upstairs. The twist she had not planned for came at breakfast. She had not slept long, 4 hours, maybe 5, and she was at the stove at her usual time. And Emma appeared at the kitchen door at 5:45 in her nightgown, the way she always did. And she looked at Hannah, and she looked at the stove, and she looked at Hannah again, with those enormous dark eyes that were entirely her father's. "You look different," Emma said. Hannah turned back to the biscuits. "I look exactly the same." "You don't," Emma said. She came into the kitchen and climbed onto her stool and looked at Hannah with the focused attention of a child who has decided to solve a problem. "You look like—" She tilted her head. "Like when the storm broke. That Tuesday morning. Remember, everything was bad, and then the sun came." Hannah looked at her over her shoulder. "That's very poetic, Emma." "I know," Emma said. "Papa looks like that too." Hannah turned back to the stove. "He came downstairs before you," Emma said. "And he made coffee. He never makes coffee. He always waits for you to make it. And he was singing something. Under his breath. Not really singing, just—" She hummed a note. "Like that." Hannah set the biscuits in the oven. "Emma," she said. "Yes. Your father and I need to talk to you this morning, and Lucas, together." She turned around and looked at Emma directly. After breakfast. Emma looked at her for a long moment. Her 9-year-old face was doing several things at once, calculating, hoping, trying to be careful about the hoping. "Is it good news?" Emma said. "Or hard news?" "It's good news," Hannah said. "For me it is. I need to know what it is for you, though. That's why we need to talk." Emma looked at her hands on the table. She was quiet in a way she rarely was, a thinking quiet, rather than a waiting one. Then she said very carefully, "Are you going to stay?" "I'd like to," Hannah said, "if you want me to." "I've wanted you to since the first biscuit," Emma said, and her voice was so simple and so complete that Hannah had to turn back to the stove again for a moment before she could trust her own face. Jacob came downstairs at 6 and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Emma at the table and Hannah at the stove and said with a careful neutrality, "Good morning." "Papa," Emma said. "I already know." Jacob looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at the biscuits. "She didn't tell me anything," Emma said. "I just know. I'm very observant." She paused. "Also, you were singing." Jacob made a sound that was not quite anything and sat down at the table. Lucas was harder, not because he was angry. He wasn't angry, or not exactly. He came in at 7 from the horses with mud on his boots, and the particular composure of a boy who has already learned to manage his face in difficult situations. And Jacob told him plainly. The way Hannah had told him, Jacob always preferred directly without build-up, without softening. That was really just delaying. Lucas listened. He didn't react. He looked at his hands, and then at the window, and then at his father, and then at Hannah. And his face was doing the thing it did when he was feeling something large and working out what to do with it. "You're going to get married," he said. "If that's all right with you," Jacob said. Lucas looked at Hannah. "You're going to stay, for real, not just as the cook." "The cooking stays," Hannah said. "I like cooking, but yes, for real." Lucas was quiet for the long time. The kitchen held the silence. Emma beside him was watching her brother with the intent look of a sister who loves someone and knows better than to push. "My mother," Lucas said finally. His voice was steady. I need to say something about my mother." "Say it," Hannah said. He looked at her directly. The dark Dawson eyes that were his father's and were going to be formidable in a few years. "She was the best person I've ever known," he said. "I need you to know that, before anything else. She was the best." "I know," Hannah said. "Your father told me. And the way you and Emma love her, and the way you both carry her, that tells me more than anything he could say. I'm not—" He stopped. He tried again. "I'm not replacing her," he said. By being okay with this. I'm not replacing her." "No," Hannah said. "You're not. Nobody is." She looked at him steadily. "There is no replacement for Rose Dawson. There shouldn't be. There won't be. What there can be, is something new beside what was, not instead of. You know the difference. You're 13, and you already know the difference." Lucas looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was tight, the way his father's got tight when he was holding something in. Then he said, "The cornbread. On the first supply wagon. You sent it without knowing if I'd even eat it." "I sent it because your father said you liked it," Hannah said. "That was enough reason." "You didn't know me," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I wanted to." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. Not the way it would break in a story that needed a theatrical moment. Quietly, the way real things break open, a small release. A breath, the particular easing of a boy who has been holding himself very tight against something for a very long time, and has finally decided to let it down. "Okay," Lucas said. Jacob's hand moved on the table toward his son. Lucas let him take it, which was more than Hannah had seen him allow in all the months she'd been watching. Emma burst into tears. Not sad tears, the other kind, the kind that have nowhere else to go. She cried the way children do when they've been hoping for something so long that when it arrives, the hope itself has to come out somehow. Lucas put his arm around her without being asked, and she cried into his shoulder, and Jacob looked at both of them with an expression that was too full for any single word. Hannah got up and went to the stove. She made breakfast. That was what she did. She made biscuits and eggs and gravy, and she set it all on the table while Emma recovered, and Lucas ate with one arm still around his sister, and Jacob drank his coffee and looked at his children and his kitchen and the woman at the stove, with the face of a man who is looking at the whole of his life and finding it for the first time in 3 years, something he wants to be inside. Brad Collins made his last move on a Saturday in April. It was not a legal move, and it was not a quiet one. He came to the county social at the Milford Grange Hall, the spring gathering that half the county attended, the kind of event where everyone saw everyone, and everything said in public stayed public. He came with the Cheyenne lawyer, and he came with a prepared speech about moral standards and community values, and the example set by prominent ranchers. He didn't get to give it. He got as far as the door. Because standing inside the door were Pete Gallagher, and Tom Briggs, and Jenkins, and Danny Walsh, and Old Roberts, and Cullum, and Clara Henderson, and her husband, and Martha Greer, and the minister and commissioner alderman, and his wife. And when Collins walked in, they did not move or speak or make any scene. They simply stood there, facing him, in the particular silence of people who have already decided and are communicating that decision without words. Collins stopped. The Cheyenne lawyer stopped behind him. Alderman stepped forward. He was 60 years old and had been in Wyoming for 40 of them, and he had a way of speaking that did not require volume to be final. He said, "Mr. Collins, you've said what you had to say before this community, and this community has said what it had to say back. I'm going to suggest, as a man who has known you since you were 17 years old, that you have spent considerable effort on a project that has produced nothing for you and cost a great deal for people who deserved better. I'm going to suggest that this evening might be a good time to let it go." Collins looked at Alderman. He looked at the line of people behind him. He looked past them to where Jacob was standing with Hannah beside him and Emma holding Hannah's hand, and Lucas standing at his father's shoulder in the way that he had recently started doing. Not seeking protection, but offering it the posture of a boy becoming a man. Collins looked at all of it. Then he turned around. He walked out the door. The Cheyenne lawyer followed. The door closed behind them both, and the room let out a collective breath, and Martha Greer said distinctly, "Well, now that that's settled," and someone laughed, and then more people laughed, and the spring social began. Hannah felt Jacob's hand find hers in the crowd. Not a showy gesture, not a declaration, just his hand closing around hers, with the quiet certainty of something decided, and she let it stay there. Emma squeezed her other hand. "He left," she said with deep satisfaction. "He left," Hannah agreed. "He's not coming back," Emma said. "No," Hannah said. "I don't think he is." Emma nodded satisfied, and went to find Clara Henderson's baby, who she had developed a considerable attachment to over the past month. The wedding was in May on a Saturday morning that had the particular quality of a Wyoming spring day, clear and enormous and cold enough still to need a coat, but with the sun fully committed and the land beginning to come back to itself after the long winter. They held it outside the main house because the main house couldn't fit the people who came, which was most of the ranch and a good portion of Milford. Martha's husband performed the ceremony. He was, as Martha had accurately noted, not a funny man, but he was a sincere one, and the words he said were simple and correct. And when he asked Jacob whether he took Hannah to be his wife, Jacob said, "I do," in a voice that was so quiet and so absolute that the people nearest him went very still for a moment, because it was the voice of a man who means a thing completely. Hannah said her words looking at Jacob's face, the weathered, serious, dark-eyed face of a man who had crossed a train platform because he couldn't not, who had asked one question that neither of them had known, yet would answer everything, and she felt the rightness of it. The way she felt the rightness of bread that had risen perfectly, the way she felt the rightness of a kitchen that had been cold and was now warm. She said, "I do," and meant every syllable of it. Emma cried again. She had apparently decided this was her right at significant occasions and exercised it without apology. Lucas stood beside his father with the ring he had helped select in Milford and handed it over when the moment came with a steadiness and a dignity that made Pete Gallagher standing behind him cough suddenly and look at the middle distance. Robert stood in the back of the gathering with his hat in his hands. When it was over, he put his hat back on and nodded once to himself with the expression of a man who has waited for something good to happen for long enough that when it does, he receives it quietly. Jenkins shook Pete's hand very hard and said nothing. Danny Walsh cried and did not pretend he wasn't, and nobody held it against him. Hannah made the wedding food herself because of course she did. It was the last thing anyone tried to argue with her about, and they lost immediately. She made everything she had learned to make in this kitchen: the biscuits, the molasses bread, 24 cinnamon rolls, a pot of bean soup that could have fed a cavalry 3 apple pies with lattice tops, a roast that had been in the oven since before dawn. She made the cornbread with honey. She set it on the long tables outside and watched 160 men and their families and the people of Milford eat, and she stood beside her husband and let him put his arm around her shoulders the way he'd started doing quietly without announcement, as though it were already the most natural thing in the world, because it was. Emma was at her left side. Lucas appeared at some point and stood beside his father, and Jacob looked at him and Lucas looked at Jacob, and some communication passed between them that was entirely wordless and entirely complete. Martha found Hannah at the end of the afternoon when the food was mostly gone and people were starting toward their wagons and the light had gone golden and low. She stood beside her and looked at the yard full of people and said without preamble, "Your mother would have been here if she could." I know, Hannah said. Have you written to her? Last week, Hannah said. She'll get the letter in another 2 weeks. She'll write back immediately. Her letters take 3 weeks to arrive, and they're always twice as long as they need to be, and full of practical advice, and I read them 3 times each. She paused. I'm going to bring her out in the fall. Jacob's already said so. Good, Martha said. She was quiet for a moment. How do you feel? Hannah looked at the yard. She looked at Emma, who was teaching the Henderson baby to clap, which the baby was not quite developmentally ready for, but was gamely attempting. She looked at Lucas, who was talking to Colum about something to do with the East horses standing. The way he stood now differently from January, differently from even a month ago, like someone who has put down a weight they'd been carrying so long they forgot it wasn't part of their body. She looked at Roberts, who was eating his 3rd piece of molasses bread, and had the expression of a man at perfect peace with his place in the world. She looked at Jacob, who was talking to Pete across the yard with one hand in his coat pocket, and the easy posture of a man who has stopped bracing for the next bad thing. And she thought about a train platform in January and $62, and a worn suitcase, and a man calling her an inconvenience, and a bench in the cold where she had sat and thought, now what? She thought about braid rising. She thought about a kitchen with good bones. She thought about 12 people standing up in a public room. She thought about a hand on her shoulder at hour 22 of a blizzard. She thought about Emma saying you look like when the storm broke. She thought about Lucas handing over a ring with steady hands at 14 years old. She thought about what her mother had always said, that a clean kitchen and a generous table were worth more than any number of pretty words. That you cooked for people, because people had specific needs and specific griefs and specific things that made them feel for a moment like the world was manageable. That feeding someone well was a form of saying, I see you. I thought about you before you got here. You matter enough to cook for. She had come 3,000 miles because she had run out of reasons to stay. She had cooked her way into a family she hadn't known she was looking for. She had fed 160 men through a blizzard, and 2 children through their grief, and 1 man through the long, slow process of remembering how to be alive in the house he'd built. And standing here now on the other side of all of it, with the Wyoming spring light going gold over a table full of food she'd made, and a yard full of people who had eaten it, she understood something she hadn't been able to see from the bench. She hadn't been rescued on that platform. Jacob Dawson had not saved her. He had asked her one question, and she had answered it, and everything that followed the work, the trust, the 12 voices, the molasses bread, the 36 hours of soup, the ground that held, she had built that herself. She had walked into a cold house with nothing but what she knew, and she had made it warm. That was not something that had been done to her, or for her, or despite her. That was her. How do I feel? She said to Martha. She looked at her husband across the yard. He looked up at the same moment the way he had started doing, as though her attention had a sound he could hear, and she felt his eyes find her the way they always did. Now steadily and completely, like a man who has found the thing he was looking for and intends to keep finding it every day. I feel like I'm home, Hannah said. And she was. Not because of the house, which was someone else's first and was hers now, not because of the ranch or the kitchen, or the Wyoming sky pressing down on everything with its enormous indifferent weight. Not because of the man across the yard, or the children, or the 160 people who had eaten her food and given something real back. She was home because she had made herself one, with her hands and her knowledge and her stubbornness. And one good question answered plainly on a train platform. In January, she had built the only kind of home that could never be taken from her, the kind that lives inside the person that travels with them, that cannot be canceled by a letter, or revoked by a cold shoulder, or left stranded on a bench with $62 and nowhere to go. Hannah Carter had come 3,000 miles to find out who she was. She had found out in a kitchen, and that was more than enough. That was everything.